Welcome back. Tonight, we settle in with the patient, painstaking work of Henrietta Leavitt, a woman who spent her days in a dim Harvard observatory, cataloguing the brightness of stars on glass photographic plates, thousands upon thousands of tiny points of light, each one measured, recorded, compared, and who, in the quiet accumulation of all that careful looking, discovered a pattern hidden in the flicker of distant Cepheid variables, a pattern that would, eventually, give us the key to measuring the universe itself. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if these stories help you drift off peacefully. Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket a little closer, and together, let us ease gently into tonight's story. On the 4th day of July, in the year 1868, in the quiet farming village of Lancaster, Massachusetts, a daughter was born to the Reverend George Roswell Leavitt and his wife, Henrietta Swan Leavitt. They named the child Henrietta after her mother, though in time she would come to be called by that name alone in the family, as a mother was often referred to by her maiden name or simply as Mrs. Leavitt, in the manner common to households of that era. The date of her birth coincided with the nation's celebration of independence, and across the young country there were parades and gatherings and the distant sounds of fireworks in the larger towns. But in Lancaster the day would have passed with the gentle observances of a rural community, where the rhythms of farming and the quiet passage of seasons set the pace of life rather than the more boisterous festivities of the cities. Lancaster itself was a small settlement situated approximately 35 miles to the northwest of Boston, nestled among the rolling hills and farmland that characterized so much of central Massachusetts in that period. It was a place of modest homes and white-steepled churches, of stone walls built by generations of farmers to mark the boundaries of their fields, and of dirt roads that wound through orchards and past meadows where cows grazed in the long summer afternoons. The town had been established in the 17th century and had grown slowly over the intervening 200 years, never becoming large or particularly prosperous, but maintaining a steady existence as a community of farmers, tradespeople, and the occasional professional family such as the Leavitts. The population in those years numbered perhaps 2,000 souls, enough to support a general store and a post office and several churches, but small enough that most families knew one another by name and by reputation, and the arrival of a new baby in the minister's household would have been noted with quiet interest by the congregation. The Leavitt family into which Henrietta was born could trace its American roots back many generations, deep into the earliest years of English settlement in Massachusetts. The family name appeared in the records of the Massachusetts Bay Colony as early as 1628, when a man named Deacon John Leavitt arrived on those shores, presumably among the waves of Puritan settlers who sought to establish a godly commonwealth in the New World. This Deacon John Leavitt would become the patriarch of a long line of New England families, and over the course of 2.5 centuries his descendants had spread across the region, establishing themselves in various towns and villages, many of them continuing in the traditions of religious devotion and community service that had characterized their ancestor. The title of deacon indicated that John Leavitt had held a position of some responsibility within his church, assisting the minister and helping to govern the spiritual affairs of the congregation, and this pattern of involvement in religious life had continued through subsequent generations, so that by the time George Roswell Leavitt entered the ministry in the 19th century, he was following a path that his family had walked for many years before him. George Roswell Leavitt served as a Congregationalist minister, which placed him within the direct descendant tradition of those original Puritan churches that had been established in colonial New England. The Congregationalists believed in the autonomy of each individual church congregation, governed not by bishops or hierarchies but by the members themselves, and they placed great emphasis on education, on the reading and interpretation of Scripture, and on the cultivation of an informed and thoughtful faith. A minister in this tradition was expected to be a man of learning, capable of preparing and delivering sermons that engaged with the complexities of theology and that applied the teachings of the Bible to the circumstances of daily life. He was also expected to visit the sick, to comfort the grieving, to counsel those facing difficult decisions, and to serve in many ways as the intellectual and moral center of his community. It was demanding work, though it was not particularly well compensated, and the Leavitt family lived on a modest income that required careful management of household resources. The salary of a Congregationalist minister in a small town like Lancaster would have been sufficient to maintain a respectable but frugal existence. The family would have had a comfortable home, likely provided by the church as a parsonage, and they would have been able to afford the necessities of life, but there would have been little money for luxuries or extravagances. This was a common circumstance for clergy families in that era, and it shaped the character of household life in ways both practical and philosophical. Economy was a virtue, and children in such families learned early that resources were to be used thoughtfully and not wasted. At the same time, the emphasis on education meant that books were considered essential rather than luxurious, and a minister's household would typically contain more books than one might find in the homes of farmers or tradespeople of similar economic means. The Leavitt children would have grown up surrounded by volumes of theology and history and literature, and they would have been encouraged from an early age to read and to develop their minds. Henrietta's mother, Henrietta Swan Leavitt, came from another established New England family, the Kendricks, who had similarly deep roots in the region. The Kendricks were what might be called old stock, meaning that they had been in Massachusetts for many generations and had become thoroughly woven into the fabric of New England society. Like the Leavitts, they valued education and piety, and they had produced their share of ministers and teachers and other professionals over the years. The marriage of George Roswell Leavitt and Henrietta Swan Leavitt was thus a union of two families with similar backgrounds and similar values, and the household they established together would have reflected those shared traditions. Both families took their religious faith seriously, and both believed in the importance of cultivating the mind as well as the soul, and these beliefs would have shaped the environment in which young Henrietta and her siblings grew up. The household included, in addition to Henrietta herself, her older brother George Roswell Jr., who had been born before her and who bore his father's name, and her younger siblings who would arrive in the years following her birth, including her sister Martha and her brother Darwin. Growing up as part of this small collection of children, Henrietta would have experienced the ordinary pleasures and challenges of 19th century New England childhood, playing in the yard of the parsonage, helping with household chores as she grew old enough to be useful, attending church services with her family on Sundays, and receiving her early education either at home or in the local school. The presence of siblings meant that she was never alone in the household, and the dynamics among the children, as in any family, would have helped to shape her character and her understanding of the world. The Sabbath observances in a minister's household would have been particularly important, and the Leavitt family would have kept Sunday as a day of rest and worship with a conscientiousness befitting the reverend's position. This meant attending church services in the morning and often again in the afternoon or evening, refraining from work and from most forms of recreation, and devoting the day to prayer and reflection and the reading of Scripture. For children, these long hours of enforced quiet and solemnity could be trying, but they also provided opportunities for contemplation and for the development of patience and self-discipline. Young Henrietta, sitting in the pew beside her mother while her father delivered his sermon from the pulpit, would have absorbed the rhythms and the language of Protestant worship, and she would have heard, week after week, the stories and the teachings of the Bible interpreted and explained by a father who took these matters very seriously indeed. Beyond the specific observances of Sunday, the intellectual culture of the church would have permeated the household throughout the week. A minister was expected to read and to study, to prepare his sermons with care, and to stay informed about theological debates and discussions. The Reverend Leavitt would have spent many hours in his study, surrounded by his books, working on the texts that he would deliver to his congregation, and the children of the household would have been aware that their father's work was a work of the mind as much as of the hands. This example of intellectual labor, conducted quietly and persistently over many years, would have been one of the early lessons that Henrietta absorbed, even if she was not yet old enough to understand the content of her father's studies. She would have seen that reading and thinking were important activities, worthy of time and effort, and that the life of the mind was valued in her family. Family members who knew Henrietta in these early years would later recall that she had been a quiet and observant child, more inclined to watch and listen than to chatter or to demand attention. This is, of course, a common observation about children who grow up to achieve distinction in intellectual fields, and one must be cautious about reading too much into such recollections, which may be colored by later knowledge of what the child became. Nonetheless, The consistent reports of her quiet temperament and her curiosity about the world around her suggest that these traits were genuinely present from an early age, and that the qualities that would later serve her so well in the patient work of astronomical observation were already beginning to develop during her Lancaster childhood. A child who watches carefully and thinks deeply about what she sees is a child who is learning to pay attention to details, to notice patterns, and to ask questions about how things work, and these habits of mind would prove invaluable in the years ahead. The early curiosity that Henrietta displayed was not directed, at this stage, toward any particular subject. She was simply a child who seemed interested in understanding the world, who asked questions about the things she observed, and who remembered what she was told. In a household that valued education and intellectual development, such curiosity would have been encouraged rather than dismissed, and her parents would likely have taken care to provide her with opportunities to learn and to satisfy her desire for knowledge. This was not yet the era of universal compulsory education, and the quality and extent of a child's schooling depended very much on the attitudes of the parents and the resources of the community. But in a minister's family, education would have been considered essential for both boys and girls, even if the expectations for what each would ultimately do with that education might have differed. The landscape of Lancaster itself, with its farms and forests and the slow procession of the seasons, would have been the backdrop against which Henrietta experienced her earliest years. The long winters with their snow and ice, the springs with their mud and new growth, the summers with their warmth and their long evenings, the autumns with their brilliant foliage and their harvests, all of these would have marked the passage of time for a child in rural Massachusetts, and they would have provided endless opportunities for observation and wonder. The night sky over Lancaster, far from the lights of any large city, would have been dark and filled with stars, and though we cannot know whether the young Henrietta looked up at those stars with any particular interest during these very early years of her life, we can note that she lived in a place and a time where the heavens were visible in all their glory to anyone who cared to look upward on a clear night. By the time Henrietta was 7 years old, in 1875, she had lived her entire short life in this small corner of New England, absorbing its values and its rhythms, growing within a family that prized learning and faith, and developing the quiet, observant temperament that would characterize her throughout her life. She could not have known, nor could anyone around her have guessed, that she would one day make contributions to human knowledge that would help to reveal the true scale of the universe, but the foundations of that future achievement were being laid in these ordinary days of childhood, in the patient accumulation of habits of attention and thought that would serve her well in all the years that followed. When Henrietta was about 10 years old, the Leavitt family gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the familiar streets of Cambridge for a new life farther west, in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, where her father George had accepted a ministerial position with the Congregationalist Church in need of steady pastoral guidance. The year was approximately 1875, and the journey would have taken the family by rail across the breadth of Massachusetts, through the green hills of New York State, and finally into the flatlands of northern Ohio, where the great expanse of Lake Erie spread out like an inland sea along the city's northern edge. For young Henrietta, this move marked a significant transition from the academic atmosphere of Cambridge, with its brick university buildings and quiet scholarly streets, to something altogether different, a place where smokestacks rose alongside church steeples and the rhythms of industry kept time with the rhythms of daily prayer. Cleveland in the mid-1870s was a city in the midst of remarkable transformation, growing rapidly from a modest lakeside settlement into one of the great industrial centers of the American Midwest. The population had swelled considerably in the years following the Civil War, and new arrivals came daily to work in the iron foundries, the oil refineries, and the manufacturing plants that lined the Cuyahoga River as it wound its way toward the lake. The air carried the particular scent of a working city, a mixture of coal smoke and lake water and the metallic tang of the mills, though in the residential neighborhoods where ministers and their families made their homes, one could still find tree-lined streets and modest gardens and the quieter pleasures of neighborhood life. The Leavitt family would have settled into a parsonage provided by the church, a comfortable if unpretentious dwelling that served as both home and extension of George Leavitt's ministerial duties, a place where parishioners might call at any hour seeking counsel or comfort or simply a few moments of prayer. The Cleveland that welcomed the Leavitt family was a city of contrasts, where great wealth accumulated in the hands of industrialists like John D. Rockefeller, who had established his Standard Oil Company there just a few years earlier, while working-class families crowded into neighborhoods near the factories and docks. The lake itself dominated the city's geography and economy, serving as a highway for the iron ore that came down from the mines of Minnesota and the coal that traveled up from Pennsylvania, raw materials that fueled the furnaces and forges that made Cleveland a center of American manufacturing. In winter, the lake effect brought heavy snows that blanketed the streets and muffled the sounds of the city, while summer brought humid breezes off the water and the particular golden light of the Midwest at sunset. For a child accustomed to the older, more established character of Cambridge, Cleveland must have seemed at once rougher and more dynamic, a place where things were being built and fortunes were being made, and the future seemed to stretch out like the lake itself, vast and full of possibility. The parsonage that housed the Leavitt family would have been a modest but comfortable dwelling, furnished with the practical furnishings appropriate to a minister's household, where appearances mattered less than the warmth of hospitality extended to all who entered. There would have been a parlor for receiving guests and holding small prayer meetings, a study where George Leavitt prepared his sermons and counseled troubled souls, bedrooms for the growing family, and a kitchen where meals were prepared with the straightforward economy that characterized middle-class households of the era. The walls might have held a few framed prints of religious subjects, perhaps a reproduction of a landscape painting, and certainly a prominent display of the family Bible, that central object around which so much of daily life revolved. Henrietta would have shared her room with her sister, and the sounds of a busy household would have filled the hours, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of her father's voice in prayer, the particular creak of floorboards that every old house develops over time. Daily life in the Leavitt household followed patterns that would have been familiar to any minister's family of the era, with morning prayers gathering everyone together before the day's activities began, and evening devotions marking the transition from waking hours to restful sleep. George Leavitt, like many Congregationalist ministers of his generation, believed in the importance of regular Bible study for children as well as adults, and Henrietta and her siblings would have spent time each day reading from Scripture, memorizing verses, and discussing the meaning of parables and prophecies. This was not a grim or joyless household, for the Congregationalist tradition valued education and inquiry alongside faith, and questions were generally welcomed rather than discouraged, so long as they were posed with appropriate reverence. The children learned early that their father's work was not merely an occupation but a calling, and that the parsonage was not merely a home but a kind of sacred space where the community came to mark its most important passages, births and deaths and marriages and conversions. Henrietta's elementary education in Cleveland took place in the public schools that served the city's growing population, institutions that reflected the era's belief in the importance of universal education for the formation of good citizens and productive members of society. The school buildings themselves would have been substantial brick structures, with high windows to admit the natural light that was essential before the widespread adoption of electric lighting, and rows of wooden desks where children sat in orderly ranks, practicing their penmanship and reciting their lessons. The curriculum emphasized the fundamental skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, along with geography, history, and the moral instruction that was considered essential to proper education. Henrietta proved herself an apt pupil from the beginning, displaying a particular facility for mathematics that set her apart from many of her classmates, an ability to grasp numerical relationships and solve problems with a kind of quiet confidence that her teachers noted with approval. Her aptitude for mathematics revealed itself in the ease with which she moved through arithmetic exercises that challenged other students, in the quickness with which she understood the logic underlying mathematical operations, and in the evident pleasure she took in working through problems to their solutions. Mathematics in the elementary schools of the 1870s focused primarily on practical skills, the ability to calculate sums and differences, to work with fractions and percentages, to solve the kinds of problems that would prove useful in commerce and daily life. Yet even within this practical framework, there was room for students like Henrietta to discover the deeper satisfactions of mathematical thinking, the elegance of a well-constructed proof, the way that numbers could reveal patterns and relationships that were not immediately obvious to the casual observer. Her teachers would have recognized her ability and perhaps provided additional challenges to keep her engaged, for capable students in that era were often given more advanced work to do once they had mastered the standard curriculum. Alongside her academic studies, Henrietta developed a genuine talent for music that found expression both at home and in the life of the church. She learned to play the piano with the patient instruction that was considered an essential part of a young lady's education, practicing scales and simple pieces until her fingers moved with increasing confidence across the keys. The piano in the parsonage parlour would have been a modest upright instrument, well suited to the accompaniment of hymns and the performance of the sentimental ballads that were popular in middle-class homes of the era. Henrietta's musical ability went beyond mere technical competence to encompass a genuine feeling for melody and harmony, an understanding of how notes combine to create something greater than their individual sounds. She joined the church choir as soon as she was old enough, adding her young voice to the weekly hymns and anthems that mark the rhythm of Congregationalist worship, learning to blend her sound with others in the pursuit of something beautiful and sacred. The social life of the Leavitt children centered largely on the Congregationalist community that gathered around their father's church, a network of families who shared their religious convictions and their approach to daily life. There were Sunday school classes where Henrietta and her siblings learned the stories of the Bible alongside the children of other church families. And there were church suppers where the women of the congregation displayed their culinary skills and the men discussed matters of theology and politics. The friendships that formed within this community were shaped by shared values and regular contact, by the knowledge that one would see the same faces week after week in the pews of the church and at the various social gatherings that punctuated the calendar. Henrietta made friends among the girls of the congregation, young people with whom she might share walks on pleasant afternoons, or quiet conversations about books and music, or the small dramas and excitements that make up the inner life of childhood. These friendships took place within a social framework that emphasized propriety and religious devotion, but this did not mean that childhood was devoid of joy or spontaneity. There were games to be played and stories to be shared, laughter in the churchyard after services, and the particular pleasure of a new friend who understood your thoughts before you had finished expressing them. The Congregationalist tradition, with its emphasis on education and intellectual engagement, created a community where curiosity was valued and questions were encouraged, and Henrietta found companions who shared her interests in learning and her quiet but genuine appreciation for the pleasures of friendship. These early social experiences would shape her approach to relationships throughout her life, forming her into someone who valued deep connections with a small circle of intimates over superficial acquaintance with a larger crowd. During the Cleveland years, the Leavitt family experienced the particular sorrow of losing an infant child, a brother of Henrietta's who did not survive the vulnerabilities of early life. Infant mortality was tragically common in this era, when even the most loving care could not protect small children from the diseases and accidents that claimed so many young lives, and families like the Leavitts, despite their comfortable circumstances and devoted attention, were not immune to such losses. The death of a sibling leaves a particular mark on children old enough to understand what has happened, a first confrontation with the reality that life is fragile and that even the youngest and most innocent are not guaranteed a full span of years. Henrietta and her remaining siblings would have watched their parents navigate this grief, finding in their faith a framework for understanding loss and a source of comfort in the midst of sorrow. George and Henrietta Kendrick Leavitt turned to their religious convictions in this time of trial, drawing strength from the promises of Scripture and the support of their church community. Funeral services for infants in this era were solemn but hope-filled occasions, emphasizing the belief that the departed child had gone to a better place and that the family would be reunited in the fullness of time. The household would have observed a period of mourning, with its rituals of black clothing and subdued activities, before gradually returning to the rhythms of normal life. For young Henrietta, this experience would have deepened her understanding of both the sorrows that life can bring and the resources that faith provides for enduring them, lessons that would prove relevant in later years when she faced her own challenges with characteristic quiet strength. It was during these Cleveland years that Henrietta began to experience the hearing difficulties that would gradually worsen throughout her life, eventually leaving her profoundly deaf. The origins of her hearing loss are not entirely certain, but it is possible that recurring ear infections during childhood, the kinds of ailments that were common in an era before antibiotics and that often left lasting damage to the delicate structures of the inner ear, played a role in the gradual diminishment of her hearing. At first, the difficulties may have been subtle, a tendency to miss soft sounds or to ask for words to be repeated, easily attributed to inattention or the ordinary distractibility of childhood. Yet over time, As infections recurred and the damage accumulated, Henrietta would have become increasingly aware that she did not hear the world quite as others did, that sounds which were clear to her siblings and friends reached her own ears muffled or incomplete. The progressive nature of her hearing loss meant that these early difficulties were harbingers of greater challenges to come, though during the Cleveland years the impairment may still have been mild enough to allow Henrietta to participate fully in school and social activities. She could still hear the hymns she sang in the church choir, still follow the lessons delivered by her teachers, still enjoy conversations with friends and family, even if she sometimes had to concentrate more carefully than others to catch every word. Her musical training continued despite these early signs of trouble, her fingers learning the piano keyboard with the same dedication even as her ears began their slow retreat from the world of sound. The full extent of her hearing loss would not become apparent until later, but the seeds were being sown during these Cleveland years, setting the stage for the silent world she would eventually inhabit. The years in Cleveland, from approximately 1875 to 1882, formed a significant chapter in Henrietta Leavitt's childhood, a time when she developed the intellectual abilities and personal qualities that would serve her throughout her life. In the classrooms of Cleveland's public schools, she discovered her aptitude for mathematics and developed habits of careful attention and thorough work. In the parsonage and the church, she absorbed the values of faith and service that her parents embodied, learning to find meaning in devotion to something larger than herself. In her music lessons and choir participation, she cultivated an appreciation for beauty and order that would later find expression in her scientific work. And in her friendships within the Congregationalist community, she formed the social bonds that would remain important to her even as she moved on to new places and new challenges. These were formative years, quiet and largely unremarkable from the outside, yet laying the foundation for everything that would follow. Henrietta Swan Leavitt spent her formative educational years moving through the careful progression of schooling that young women of her era and social standing would have expected, though perhaps with a quietude and steady determination that set her somewhat apart from her peers. In the Cleveland schools where she completed her secondary education during the early 1880s, she demonstrated the kind of consistent academic excellence that pleased her teachers and satisfied her family's expectations, earning marks that placed her reliably among the top students in her classes. Her report cards from this period, preserved in the family records, show a pattern of high achievement across all her subjects, with particular strength in mathematics and the classical languages that formed the backbone of a proper education in that time. She was not, by any account, a boisterous or attention-seeking student, but rather one who completed her work with care and submitted it without fanfare, content to let her grades speak for whatever needed speaking. The Cleveland of Henrietta's youth was a city of considerable cultural ambition, having grown rapidly in the decades following the Civil War into a prosperous center of commerce and industry along the southern shore of Lake Erie. The public school system reflected this ambition, offering a curriculum designed to prepare young people for lives of usefulness and, in the case of those with means and inclination, for higher education. Henrietta moved through her classes with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested a mind already oriented toward larger pursuits, absorbing her lessons in history and composition and arithmetic with equal diligence. She was remembered by those who knew her during these years as pleasant and unassuming, a young woman who kept her own counsel and found her satisfactions in her books and in the small circle of friends with whom she felt comfortable. When the time came to consider what should follow her secondary schooling, the Leavitt family engaged in the sort of careful deliberation that characterized their approach to most significant decisions. George Leavitt, as a Congregationalist minister, valued education deeply and had always encouraged scholarly pursuits in his children, believing that the cultivation of the mind was among the highest callings a person could follow. He and Henrietta's mother discussed the matter thoroughly, weighing the options available for a young woman of their daughter's abilities and temperament. The result of these discussions was the decision that Henrietta would enroll at Oberlin College in Ohio, an institution that held particular appeal for a family of their religious convictions and progressive sympathies. Oberlin College occupied a unique and rather remarkable position in the landscape of American higher education during the 1880s. It had been founded in 1833 in the small town of Oberlin, Ohio, some 35 miles southwest of Cleveland, and from its very beginning it had pursued a mission that set it apart from nearly every other institution of its kind. The founders, two Presbyterian ministers named John J. Shipperd and Philo Stewart, had established the college as part of a utopian Christian community dedicated to social reform and the spreading of the gospel. What made Oberlin truly distinctive, however, was its commitment to admitting students regardless of their sex or their race, a policy that was revolutionary in its time and remained exceptional even 50 years later when Henrietta arrived on its campus. In 1833, Oberlin became the first coeducational college in America, opening its doors to women alongside men at a time when the very idea of women pursuing higher education was considered by many to be unnecessary at best and dangerous at worst. The college had further distinguished itself in 1835 by becoming the first institution of higher learning in the country to regularly admit African American students, a decision that drew both praise and condemnation and that firmly established Oberlin's reputation as a place of bold social experimentation. By the time Henrietta enrolled in 1885, the college had graduated hundreds of women and had produced a steady stream of abolitionists, missionaries, and reformers who carried Oberlin's idealistic spirit into the wider world. The campus itself retained something of the earnest, purposeful atmosphere that had characterized its founding years, with students expected to combine their academic work with practical labor and moral improvement. Henrietta entered Oberlin initially at the preparatory level, as was common for students whose secondary education, however excellent, had not perfectly aligned with the college's entrance requirements in certain subjects. The preparatory program was designed to bring students up to the standard required for full collegiate work, and it was neither unusual nor stigmatizing to spend a year or more in this preliminary course of study. The curriculum at this level emphasized the classical languages and mathematics that form the foundation of all advanced learning, and Henrietta applied herself to these subjects with the same quiet diligence she had shown throughout her earlier schooling. Her marks continued to be strong, and she progressed through the preparatory work at a steady pace, demonstrating particular aptitude for the precise and logical thinking that her mathematical studies required. Latin occupied a central place in Henrietta's coursework during her years at Oberlin, as it did in the education of virtually all serious students of that era. The study of Latin was considered essential not merely for the access it provided to the great works of Roman literature and philosophy, but for the discipline it imposed upon the mind, training students in careful analysis and grammatical precision. Henrietta worked her way through the standard texts, translating passages from Cicero and Virgil and committing to memory the complex system of declensions and conjugations that the language demanded. Greek presented similar challenges and similar rewards, opening a window onto the foundational texts of Western civilization, from the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle to the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides. The hours spent parsing sentences and looking up unfamiliar words were long and sometimes tedious, but they cultivated habits of patience and attention to detail that would serve Henrietta well in ways she could not yet have imagined. Mathematics at Oberlin extended beyond the arithmetic and basic algebra of secondary school into more advanced territory, including geometry, trigonometry, and the beginnings of higher mathematics. Henrietta found these subjects congenial to her particular cast of mind, which seemed naturally inclined toward the kind of systematic thinking that mathematical work rewarded. There was something satisfying in the way that mathematical problems, unlike so many other things in life, had definite solutions that could be reached through the proper application of established methods, and Henrietta moved through her problem sets with a quiet confidence that her instructors noted with approval. The habits of precision and verification that she developed during these years, the careful checking and rechecking of calculations, would later become central to her professional identity in ways that neither she nor her teachers could have anticipated. Natural philosophy, as the study of the physical sciences was still often called, rounded out the core of Henrietta's academic work at Oberlin. This broad subject encompassed what would later be divided into physics, chemistry, and other specialized disciplines, and it introduced students to the fundamental principles governing the behavior of matter and energy. Henrietta learned about the laws of motion and the properties of light, about chemical reactions and the structure of matter, acquiring a basic scientific vocabulary and framework that would prove valuable when her interests later turned more specifically toward astronomy. The teaching of natural philosophy at Oberlin, like the teaching of all subjects at the college, was informed by the institution's religious ethos, with instructors taking care to present scientific knowledge as compatible with and indeed supportive of Christian faith. The wonders of the natural world, properly understood, were taken to reveal the wisdom and benevolence of the Creator. Beyond her formal coursework, Henrietta participated in the literary societies that formed an important part of student life at Oberlin, as they did at most American colleges during this period. These societies provided opportunities for students to practice public speaking and debate, to read and discuss works of literature, and to form friendships with others who shared their intellectual interests. For a young woman of Henrietta's reserved temperament, the literary society offered a comfortable middle ground between solitary study and the more boisterous forms of social life that did not particularly appeal to her. She could contribute her thoughts in a structured setting, listen to the ideas of others, and enjoy a sense of belonging to a community of minds without being required to perform the kind of social exuberance that came more naturally to some of her peers. Music also played a role in Henrietta's life at Oberlin, which had established one of the first conservatories of music in America and placed considerable emphasis on musical education as part of its mission to cultivate the whole person. While Henrietta did not pursue music with the same intensity that she brought to her academic studies, she participated in the musical programs available to students and developed an appreciation for the art that would remain with her throughout her life. The college chapel services, with their hymns and anthems, provided regular occasions for communal singing, and the conservatory's concerts and recitals offered exposure to more ambitious musical works. In the quiet hours of her own time, Henrietta could sometimes be found at the piano, playing with a competence that suggested steady practice if not exceptional talent. The atmosphere at Oberlin during Henrietta's years there was one of earnest purpose and moral seriousness, tempered by a genuine warmth and sense of community among students and faculty alike. Women were taken seriously as students and scholars, expected to complete the same rigorous coursework as their male counterparts and to contribute meaningfully to the intellectual life of the college. This progressive attitude toward women's education was not merely tolerated but actively promoted, with faculty and administrators expressing the belief that educated women would be better mothers, better teachers, and better citizens. For Henrietta, whose intellectual ambitions were considerable even if she did not always express them openly, this environment provided a welcome confirmation that her scholarly aspirations were legitimate and worthy of pursuit. As Henrietta's 2 years at Oberlin drew toward their close, she and her family began to consider what should come next. She had completed her preparatory work and begun her collegiate studies, and she had thrived in the academic environment, but questions arose about whether Oberlin remained the best setting for her continued education. The family circumstances had shifted somewhat during these years, as family circumstances do, and there were practical considerations to weigh alongside the purely academic ones. The cost of maintaining Henrietta at a college several hundred miles from home was not inconsiderable, and the family's resources, while adequate, were not unlimited. Moreover, Henrietta herself had begun to form a clearer sense of her own intellectual interests and ambitions, and she wondered whether other institutions might offer opportunities that Oberlin could not. The discussions that took place within the Leavitt family during this period were careful and considerate, as was typical of their deliberations on important matters. George Leavitt valued his daughter's judgment and wished to support her aspirations, while also feeling the responsibility to guide her toward decisions that were prudent and wise. Henrietta's mother contributed her own perspective, concerned as mothers are with both the practical details and the emotional well-being of her daughter. The question of where Henrietta should continue her education was weighed from multiple angles, considering not only the academic merits of various institutions but also their costs, their locations, and their suitability for a young woman of Henrietta's particular character and needs. What emerged from these family discussions was the decision that Henrietta would transfer to the Society for the Collegiate Instruction of Women, an institution located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that would later become known as Radcliffe College. This organization, established in 1879, provided women with the opportunity to receive instruction from the faculty of Harvard University, an institution that did not itself admit women but that allowed its professors to teach female students separately for a fee. The arrangement was somewhat awkward and certainly reflected the prejudices of the time, but it offered access to some of the finest scholars and most advanced instruction available in America. For a young woman of serious intellectual ambition, the opportunity to study under Harvard faculty was not easily dismissed. The financial implications of this move were significant and required careful planning. The Society for the Collegiate Instruction of Women was more expensive than Oberlin, and Cambridge was farther from the family's home, which added to the costs of travel and communication. The Leavitt family was not wealthy, and the decision to send Henrietta to Cambridge required sacrifices and economies elsewhere. Yet the family believed that the investment was worthwhile, that Henrietta's abilities deserved the best education available, and that the opportunities afforded by proximity to Harvard would serve her well in whatever path her life might take. There was also, perhaps, a sense that Henrietta was ready for a new environment, a place where she could grow into the scholar she was becoming, free from the familiarity of Ohio and the patterns of her earlier years. In 1888, Henrietta made the journey east to Massachusetts, leaving behind the campus at Oberlin and the life she had built there during her 2 years of study. She was 20 years old, a young woman of evident intelligence and quiet determination, with a serious purpose in her heart and a mind that had been trained to think carefully and precisely. The world of Harvard and Cambridge awaited her, with its libraries and laboratories and learned professors, and Henrietta approached this new chapter with the same steady resolve that had characterized her entire educational journey. She did not know, could not have known, what discoveries lay ahead or what contributions she would one day make to human knowledge. She knew only that she wished to learn, to understand, and to apply her mind to whatever questions proved worthy of her attention. In the autumn of 1888, Henrietta Swan Leavitt arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a young woman of 23 years who had journeyed eastward from her family's home to pursue an education that would, in time, reshape humanity's understanding of the cosmos, though of course she could not have known this as she made her way through the quiet streets of that scholarly town, past the brick buildings and the elms that lined the walks, carrying with her the curiosity and determination that had characterized her youth. She had enrolled at the Society for the Collegiate Instruction of Women, an institution that occupied a peculiar position in the academic landscape of late 19th century America, existing in the shadow of Harvard College while offering women an education that was, in substance if not in name, equivalent to what young men received at that venerable institution just across the way. The arrangement was one born of compromise and of the slow, gradual expansion of opportunities for women in higher education, and it would serve as the backdrop for 4 years of intellectual growth that would set the course of Henrietta's life in directions she could scarcely have imagined as she settled into her new surroundings. The Society for the Collegiate Instruction of Women had been established in 1879 by Arthur Gilman and others who recognized both the desire of women to receive a rigorous education and the reluctance of Harvard to admit them directly into its classrooms. The solution they devised was an elegant if somewhat awkward one, whereby Harvard professors would deliver lectures to women in separate settings, covering the same material and maintaining the same standards as they did for the men at the college. The women who attended these courses received certificates rather than degrees in the formal sense, though these certificates were understood to represent an education equivalent to the bachelor's degree conferred upon Harvard men, and in 1894, some 2 years after Henrietta's graduation, the institution would be renamed Radcliffe College in honor of Anne Radcliffe, the first woman to give funds to Harvard. But during Henrietta's years there, it was still known by its longer and somewhat more cumbersome name, and the women who studied within its programs navigated a world where their intellectual ambitions were accommodated through these careful arrangements with the university next door. Cambridge itself was a place steeped in scholarly tradition, its streets and buildings carrying the weight of centuries of academic endeavor, and for a young woman interested in learning, it offered an environment rich with intellectual stimulation. The town centered around Harvard College, which had been established in 1636 and had grown over the generations into one of the foremost centers of higher education in the nation. The Harvard College Observatory, situated on Observatory Hill just northwest of the main campus, represented the university's commitment to astronomical research, and its presence in Cambridge meant that the study of the heavens was woven into the fabric of the town's intellectual life in ways both visible and subtle. For Henrietta, who had come to discover her passion for astronomy only in her final year of study, this proximity to one of the world's leading astronomical institutions would prove to be profoundly significant. though during her early years at the Society for the Collegiate Instruction of Women, her interests ranged across a broad spectrum of subjects, and she approached her education with the kind of open curiosity that characterized the best students of her era. The curriculum that Henrietta followed during her 4 years in Cambridge was remarkably diverse, reflecting both the breadth of the liberal arts education offered to women at the institution and her own wide-ranging intellectual appetites. She took courses in fine arts, studying the principles of aesthetic appreciation and the history of artistic achievement, learning to perceive beauty and meaning in the works of painters and sculptors across the centuries. Philosophy occupied another portion of her studies, introducing her to the great questions that had occupied human minds since antiquity, questions about the nature of knowledge, the foundations of ethics, and the structure of reality itself. She studied classical Greek, that ancient language that had given voice to poets and philosophers, to historians and dramatists, and in learning its grammar and vocabulary, she gained access to texts that had shaped Western thought for millennia. Foreign languages more broadly formed part of her education as well, for the ability to read and communicate across linguistic boundaries was considered essential for any cultivated person of the time, and Henrietta applied herself to these studies with the same diligence she brought to all her coursework. The intellectual atmosphere at the Society for the Collegiate Instruction of Women was one of earnest application and mutual support among the students who had gathered there from various parts of the country. Henrietta formed friendships with her classmates, young women who shared her commitment to education and who provided companionship and encouragement through the long hours of study and the various social activities that punctuated academic life. She participated in the campus activities that were available to students, engaging with the community of scholars in ways that extended beyond the classroom, and these friendships and experiences contributed to the texture of her years in Cambridge, making them not merely a time of intellectual development but also of personal growth and connection. The women who studied together at the institution understood that they were pioneers of a sort, participants in an experiment in women's education that was still proving itself to a skeptical world, and this shared sense of purpose bound them together even as they pursued their individual interests and ambitions. It was in her senior year, spanning 1891 to 1892, that Henrietta enrolled in a course that would transform her understanding of her own calling. The astronomy course was taught by Professor Edward Charles Pickering, the director of the Harvard College Observatory, a man whose influence on the field of astronomy and on Henrietta's own career would prove to be immense. Pickering was a figure of considerable standing in the astronomical community, having taken the helm of the observatory in 1877 and having begun to transform it into one of the world's leading centers for stellar research. He was known for his innovative approaches to the classification of stars and for his willingness to employ women in scientific work at the observatory, a practice that was unusual for the time and that would create opportunities for Henrietta and others like her in the years to come. Under his instruction, Henrietta was introduced to the science of the heavens in a systematic and rigorous manner, and she discovered in this subject a fascination that would endure for the rest of her life. The astronomy course covered a range of topics that provided students with a foundation in both the theoretical and practical aspects of the science. Celestial mechanics formed one portion of the curriculum, introducing students to the mathematical principles that govern the motions of heavenly bodies, the laws of gravitation that held planets in their orbits and determined the trajectories of comets as they swept through the solar system. This was the astronomy of Newton and Kepler, of precise calculations and elegant equations that described the clockwork of the cosmos with remarkable accuracy. Stellar classification represented another area of study, teaching students how astronomers categorized the countless stars that filled the night sky according to their spectral characteristics, their brightness, their colors, and other observable properties. This was work that the Harvard College Observatory was pioneering under Pickering's direction, developing systems of classification that would allow astronomers to make sense of the overwhelming diversity of stars and to begin to understand the physical processes that govern their existence. Observation techniques rounded out the course, providing practical instruction in the methods astronomers used to gather data about the heavens, from the use of telescopes to the interpretation of photographic plates that captured the light of distant stars. Henrietta excelled in this course, receiving a mark of A that reflected both her natural aptitude for the subject and the dedication she brought to her studies. There was something in the precision and beauty of astronomy that resonated with her, Perhaps the way it combined careful observation with mathematical analysis, or perhaps the sheer wonder of contemplating objects so distant and so vast that the human mind could scarcely comprehend them. Whatever the source of her attraction to the field, it was clear by the end of her senior year that astronomy had captured her imagination in a way that her other subjects, worthy as they were, had not quite managed to do. The grade she received was a testament to her abilities, but more importantly, the course had awakened in her a passion that would shape the remainder of her life and career. During her years in Cambridge, however, Henrietta was also contending with a development that would have significant implications for her future, both personal and professional. Her hearing, which may have been affected during her childhood or early adulthood, was growing progressively worse during this period. The precise cause of her hearing loss has never been definitively established, but medical historians have speculated that it may have resulted from scarlet fever, an infectious disease that was common in the 19th century and that could damage the delicate structures of the inner ear, or alternatively from progressive otosclerosis, a condition in which abnormal bone growth in the middle ear gradually impairs the transmission of sound. Whatever the underlying cause, the effect was a slow diminution of her ability to hear, a gradual withdrawal from the world of sound that must have been distressing for a young woman in the prime of her life. Hearing loss in that era carried with it particular challenges that are difficult to appreciate fully from the vantage point of modern times. The technologies that we take for granted today, the hearing aids and cochlear implants and other devices that can restore or enhance hearing, simply did not exist, and those who experienced deafness or partial deafness were obliged to adapt as best they could to a world that was not designed to accommodate their needs. For Henrietta, this meant developing strategies for communication that did not rely entirely on spoken words, learning to read lips and to pay close attention to visual cues, and perhaps finding refuge in the written word, which remained accessible to her regardless of how much her hearing declined. The condition may also have contributed to a certain reserve in her personality, a tendency toward quiet observation rather than voluble conversation, though it is difficult to disentangle the effects of her hearing loss from her natural temperament. Despite this challenge, Henrietta completed her studies successfully, graduating in 1892 with a certificate from the Society for the Collegiate Instruction of Women. This certificate, as noted, was considered equivalent to the bachelor's degree that Harvard conferred upon its male students, and it represented the successful completion of 4 years of rigorous academic work. She had arrived in Cambridge as a young woman with broad curiosity and undefined ambitions, and she departed with both a formal credential and, more importantly, a sense of direction that her final year of study had provided. Astronomy had revealed itself to her as a field worthy of her talents and her dedication, and though the path forward was not yet clear, she had taken the first steps toward a career that would leave an indelible mark on scientific history. The proximity of the Harvard College Observatory to the institution where she had studied was not merely a geographical coincidence, but a circumstance that would prove to be of considerable significance in the years ahead. Pickering's observatory was actively engaged in ambitious projects to map and classify the stars, work that required careful analysis of photographic plates and meticulous attention to detail, and the director had shown himself willing to employ women in this work. Henrietta did not immediately take up a position at the observatory upon her graduation, for there were other chapters of her life yet to unfold before she would return to Cambridge and to the study of the stars. But the foundation had been laid, the connection had been established, and the seed that had been planted in her senior year astronomy course would, in time, grow into something remarkable. For now, though, in the spring of 1892, she was simply a young woman of 27 years, holding her certificate, contemplating her future, and carrying with her both the promise of her education and the challenge of her diminishing hearing as she prepared to step out into the wider world. In the months following her graduation from Radcliffe College in 1892, Henrietta Swan Leavitt found herself in a position that was familiar to many young women of her generation and social standing, which is to say she found herself at something of a crossroads, with an excellent education behind her and a future that remained pleasantly but persistently undefined. The summer of that year passed quietly in Cambridge, and then in the family home, as she considered what shape her life might take now that the structure of academic terms and examinations had come to an end. She had distinguished herself in her studies, particularly in that final course in practical astronomy that had captured her imagination so completely, and yet the path from academic interest to professional occupation was not at all clear, not for a woman in the closing decade of the 19th century, when the doors to scientific careers remained largely closed or opened only to narrow corridors that led to volunteer positions and unpaid assistantships. The period between 1892 and 1895 has sometimes been overlooked in accounts of Leavitt's life, perhaps because it lacks the dramatic arc of her later discoveries, and yet these years were formative in their own quiet way, as years of uncertainty so often are. She spent time with her family, maintained her correspondence with friends from her college days, and began to confront, with what appears to have been her characteristic patience and practicality, the question of what an educated woman might do with herself when the conventional options seemed either uninspiring or increasingly difficult to pursue. Her father's work as a congregational minister meant that the family moved with some regularity, and Henrietta moved with them for a time, part of a household that valued learning and faith in equal measure, and that supported her in ways both material and emotional during this transitional period. In 1893, Henrietta undertook a journey that was considered an appropriate and even expected experience for young women of her background, which was an extended trip to Europe to broaden her cultural horizons and provide a kind of finishing education that complemented her academic credentials. She traveled to England, where she visited the kinds of sites that educated Americans of her era sought out, the museums and cathedrals and historic landmarks that represented the deep cultural heritage that America, still a relatively young nation, looked to with a mixture of admiration and aspiration. She spent time in Scotland as well, and it is possible that she visited destinations on the European continent, though the records of her precise itinerary have not survived in complete detail. What we do know is that she traveled with the curiosity and attentiveness that would later characterize her scientific work, observing carefully, taking note of what she saw, and filing away impressions that would remain with her for years to come. Travel in this era was a rather different experience than it would become in later decades, involving long ocean crossings on steamships, the careful management of trunks and traveling clothes, and the navigation of foreign cities with the aid of guidebooks and the occasional letter of introduction. For a young woman traveling in the 1890s, such a journey required planning and resources, and it was typically undertaken in the company of family members or trusted companions, as propriety demanded and safety suggested. Henrietta's family, while not wealthy by the standards of the great industrialist families of the era, was comfortable enough to provide this experience for their daughter, and they clearly valued the broadening effect that such travel was believed to have on a young person's mind and character. The months abroad provided Henrietta with a kind of breathing space, a pause between the structured world of college and whatever came next, and there was a long tradition in American culture of regarding European travel as a capstone to a young person's education, a way of connecting the knowledge gained from books to the living reality of the places and peoples that had produced that knowledge. She would have seen great works of art in person, stood in buildings that had witnessed centuries of history, and encountered ways of life that differed from what she had known in Massachusetts and the American Midwest. And through it all, she remained in correspondence with her family and with the friends she had made at Radcliffe, those bonds of affection and intellectual companionship that would sustain her throughout her life. Upon her return to the United States, Henrietta took up a position that was one of the few respectable options available to an educated woman who needed or wished to support herself, which was teaching. She secured a post at a preparatory school in Beloit, Wisconsin, a small city in the southern part of that state, where she taught art and possibly other subjects as well. The position was a reasonable one for a woman of her qualifications, and teaching was considered an appropriate profession for educated women, one that made use of their learning while keeping them within acceptable social boundaries. Many of Leavitt's contemporaries from Radcliffe and similar institutions took up teaching positions in these years, some finding the work fulfilling and others regarding it as a temporary measure until marriage or other circumstances changed their situation. The preparatory school in Beloit would have served students who were preparing for college or for lives in business and the professions, and the teaching of art was considered a suitable subject for a woman instructor, touching as it did on matters of culture and refinement rather than the more technical or commercial subjects that male instructors typically handled. Henrietta brought to her teaching the same conscientiousness that she brought to everything she did, preparing her lessons carefully and attending to her students with patience and care. The work was respectable and useful, and it provided her with a modest income and a sense of purpose during a period when her larger direction in life remained uncertain. And yet the teaching did not go smoothly, or at least not as smoothly as it might have, because during this period Henrietta began to experience in earnest a condition that would affect her for the rest of her life, which was progressive hearing loss. The origins of this condition are not entirely clear, and various causes have been suggested over the years, including the possibility of a childhood illness or a gradual degenerative condition that worsened over time. What is clear is that by the mid-1890s, her hearing had deteriorated to the point where it created real difficulties in the classroom, where a teacher must be able to hear her students' questions and responses, must be able to gauge from the sounds of a room whether attention is being paid and understanding is being reached. The hearing loss was gradual, which is both a blessing and a challenge, as it allows for accommodation but also for a slow accumulation of frustrations and missed moments. Henrietta would have found herself asking students to repeat themselves, straining to catch words that came to her muffled or distorted, and experiencing the particular isolation that comes with difficulty hearing in social situations. For someone whose work required constant verbal interaction with young people, this was a significant obstacle, and it may have contributed to her growing sense that teaching, however respectable, was not the career for which she was best suited. It is worth pausing here to consider the limited range of options that were available to educated women in the 1890s, because understanding these constraints helps us appreciate both the difficulty of Leavitt's situation and the significance of the choices she would eventually make. For a woman with a college degree in this era, the primary respectable occupations were teaching, nursing, and domestic life, which is to say marriage and the raising of children. A few pioneering women had made their way into medicine or law, but these paths were difficult and often hostile, requiring exceptional determination and a willingness to endure considerable opposition. Scientific research was almost entirely the province of men, conducted at universities and observatories that did not admit women to their professional ranks, and the few women who participated in scientific work typically did so as volunteers or as poorly paid assistants, often performing the tedious computational work that male scientists preferred to delegate. This was the context in which Henrietta Leavitt considered her future, a context that offered few obvious paths for a woman with her intellectual gifts and her growing interest in astronomical work. She had loved her course in practical astronomy at Radcliffe, had found in the careful observation and mathematical analysis of celestial phenomena something that suited her temperament and abilities, and yet there was no clear way to pursue this interest as a profession. The great observatories were staffed by men, the university positions were closed to women, and even the most talented female astronomer could expect, at best, to work as an unpaid volunteer or a low-paid computer, cataloguing data and performing calculations while male colleagues received credit for the discoveries that emerged from this labor. During her time in Wisconsin, Henrietta maintained her correspondence with family and friends, writing letters that kept her connected to the people and places she had left behind. The Leavitt family was a close one, bound by ties of affection and shared faith, and Henrietta's letters would have conveyed news of her work and her daily life while also expressing the longing for home that is natural when one is far from loved ones. Her friends from Radcliffe were scattered now, pursuing their own paths through teaching and marriage and the various other occupations that life presented, but the bonds formed during those college years remained strong, and the exchange of letters provided a kind of ongoing conversation that distance could not entirely interrupt. As the months passed and the school year drew toward its close, Henrietta began to think more seriously about returning to Cambridge and to the astronomical work that had so captivated her during her final year at Radcliffe. The difficulties of classroom teaching, exacerbated by her hearing loss, had made clear that this was not the right path for her, and her mind kept returning to the quiet, methodical work of analyzing stellar photographs, work that required patience and precision but not the constant verbal interaction that her condition made so challenging. In astronomical computation, her hearing difficulties would matter far less, as the work was conducted in relative silence, with colleagues communicating through written notes or brief conversations that could be managed even with impaired hearing. In 1895, Henrietta made the decision to return to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she had spent her college years and where the Harvard College Observatory offered a possible, if uncertain, opportunity. The observatory, under the direction of Edward Pickering, had become known for employing women in computational roles, work that involved the painstaking analysis of photographic plates to catalogue and classify the thousands of stars captured in each image. These women, who would later be known informally as the Harvard computers, worked for low wages or sometimes as volunteers, but they had access to real astronomical data and the opportunity to contribute to genuine scientific work, which was more than most institutions offered to women of that era. Henrietta's decision to volunteer at the observatory was both practical and aspirational, a way of gaining experience and demonstrating her abilities while positioning herself for possible paid employment should such opportunities arise. She had no guarantee that anything would come of this effort, no promise of a salary or a position, and yet she was drawn to the work itself, to the quiet satisfaction of careful observation and the possibility of contributing, in however small a way, to the growing human understanding of the universe. She returned to Cambridge with modest expectations and considerable determination, ready to begin what would become her life's work, though she could not have known then where that work would lead or what discoveries awaited her in the countless points of light captured on the observatory's glass photographic plates. And so the years of uncertainty drew to a close, those years of travel and teaching and gradual self-discovery, and Henrietta Swan Leavitt prepared to enter a new chapter of her life, one that would unfold slowly and quietly in the careful examination of stellar images, in the patient accumulation of data, and in the eventual recognition of patterns that would change our understanding of the cosmos. The path from Beloit, Wisconsin, to the Harvard College Observatory was not a dramatic one, not marked by sudden revelations or decisive moments, but rather by the gradual clarification of purpose that comes when a person finds work that suits her abilities and engages her deepest interests. In 1895, as she took up her volunteer position among the women computers of the observatory, Henrietta could not have foreseen the significance of what lay ahead, and she approached her new work with the same quiet diligence that had characterized her efforts in the classroom, not knowing that she was beginning a journey that would take her to the very edges of the known universe and beyond. In the year 1895, Henrietta Swan Leavitt arrived at the Harvard College Observatory as an unpaid volunteer, carrying with her a degree from Radcliffe College and a quiet determination that would, in time, reshape humanity's understanding of the cosmos, though of course she could not have known this then, and indeed the work that awaited her seemed, on its surface, to be the very definition of painstaking routine. The observatory sat on a gentle rise in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and at its helm was a man named Edward Charles Pickering, who had served as director since 1877 and who possessed, among his many qualities, an unusual willingness to recognize capability wherever he found it, regardless of whether that capability resided in a person whom society deemed suited for scientific work. Pickering was building something unprecedented, a systematic survey of the heavens conducted not through the eyepiece of a telescope in the cold night air, but through the careful analysis of glass photographic plates that captured the light of thousands upon thousands of stars, and for this monumental task he required many hands and many patient minds, and he found them, as it happened, among women who had few other avenues into the world of professional science. The group that Henrietta Leavitt joined came to be known, in the formal terminology of the observatory, as the Harvard computers, though others in the scientific community and beyond sometimes referred to them by a less respectful name, calling them Pickering's harem in a tone that was meant to diminish both the women and the work they performed. This dismissive label revealed far more about the prejudices of the era than about the nature of the labor itself, for the work of the Harvard computers was exacting and essential, requiring intelligence, patience, and a capacity for sustained concentration that few could match. Among the women already at work when Henrietta arrived were figures who would become luminaries in their own right: Williamina Fleming, who had come to the observatory first as a domestic servant in Pickering's household before proving herself so capable that he hired her for scientific work, and who would go on to develop classification systems for stellar spectra, and Annie Jump Cannon, whose encyclopedic knowledge of the stars would eventually allow her to classify spectra at a rate that seemed almost superhuman, and Antonia Mori, whose meticulous attention to the subtle variations in spectral lines led her to propose classification schemes that were, perhaps, too sophisticated for her contemporaries to fully appreciate. These women, and others who joined them over the years, formed a community of scholars working in conditions that were simultaneously groundbreaking and constrained, for they were permitted to contribute to science in ways that had been closed to women before, and yet they were paid far less than their male counterparts and were rarely credited in the manner that their work deserved. The physical setting in which this work took place was a room in what was known as the Brick Building, a structure adjacent to the main observatory dome, and if you were to step inside that room in the late 1890s, you would find long wooden tables arranged in rows, each table covered with the tools of the computer's trade. There were magnifying glasses of various strengths, some mounted on stands to free the hands for other tasks, and there were rulers marked with fine gradations, and there were logarithm tables, those dense columns of numbers that allowed for the conversion of one quantity into another through the patient arithmetic that predated mechanical calculation. The light came through tall windows, and the women bent over their work with a concentration that the casual observer might have mistaken for mere clerical labor, but which was, in truth, a form of careful scientific measurement, the translation of photographic images into numerical data that could be analyzed and compared and, ultimately, understood. The air in that room would have carried the faint chemical smell of the photographic plates themselves, those glass rectangles coated with a light-sensitive emulsion that had, during long exposures at the telescope, recorded the positions and brightnesses of stars too numerous to count by any other means. Henrietta Leavitt began her work at the observatory as a volunteer, which is to say that she received no payment at all for her labor, a circumstance that was not unusual for women seeking to enter fields that did not readily welcome them. She returned to her home in Wisconsin for a period due to declining health and family obligations, as her hearing, which had begun to fade during her college years, continued to worsen, creating a silence around her that would deepen throughout her life. When she returned to the observatory in 1902, it was as a permanent member of the staff, and at that time she began to receive a salary of 30 cents per hour, a wage that might seem, and indeed was, quite modest, though it represented an acknowledgement that her work had value and that she had earned a place among the computers. In time, and for reasons that the historical record does not fully explain, her hourly wage was reduced to 25 cents, a sum that stood in stark contrast to the earnings of male assistants at the observatory, who received considerably more for work that was, in many cases, no more demanding and no more skilled. This disparity was simply a fact of the era, one of many inequities that women in science were obliged to navigate, and Henrietta, like her colleagues, continued her work without recorded complaint, perhaps because she understood that the opportunity to engage with the stars at all was a privilege that could be revoked, or perhaps because she recognized that the value of her contributions would, in time, speak for itself. The photographic plates upon which the computers worked were drawn from an archive of remarkable scope, for Pickering had established a network of observations that extended far beyond the single telescope in Cambridge. In the mountains near Arequipa, Peru, the observatory maintained a southern station, and from this vantage point, telescopes captured images of the skies that were invisible from the northern hemisphere, including the two hazy patches of light known as the Magellanic Clouds, which hang in the southern sky like fragments of the Milky Way that have drifted away from the main band of stars. The plates from Arequipa were shipped back to Cambridge, where they joined the thousands of other plates in the archive, each one a frozen moment of starlight, a record of the heavens as they appeared on a particular night from a particular place on Earth. The archive grew steadily, year by year, until it contained a treasury of astronomical data that would take decades to fully analyze, and it was into this ocean of glass and silver that Henrietta Leavitt waded, magnifying glass in hand, searching for patterns that others had not yet seen. The overarching project that gave structure to much of the observatory's work during these years was the Henry Draper Memorial, a catalogue of stellar spectra funded by the widow of the astronomer Henry Draper, who had been a pioneer in the photography of stars and who had died young, leaving his wife, Anna Palmer Draper, with the means and the desire to see his work continued. The goal of the Henry Draper Memorial was nothing less than the classification of every star bright enough to leave an impression on a photographic plate, a task that would require the examination of hundreds of thousands of spectra and the assignment of each to a category based on the particular pattern of dark lines that crossed its band of light. These spectral lines, which arise from the absorption of specific wavelengths by the elements in a star's outer atmosphere, serve as a kind of fingerprint, revealing the temperature and composition of distant suns, and the work of sorting stars by their spectra was foundational to the emerging science of astrophysics. Williamina Fleming, Annie Jump Cannon, and Antonia Mora each contributed classification schemes to this great project, and the system that ultimately prevailed, the familiar sequence of O, B, A, F, G, K, M that astronomy students still learn today, emerged from Annie Jump Cannon's tireless work over many years. Henrietta Leavitt participated in this broader effort, but her particular talents and interests would lead her in a somewhat different direction, towards stars whose brightness was not constant but instead rose and fell in rhythms that demanded explanation. Director Pickering recognized that Henrietta possessed a particular aptitude for the painstaking work of photometry, the measurement of stellar brightness, and he assigned her to a project that would prove to be ideally suited to her temperament and her skills. She was to study the variable stars in the Magellanic Clouds, those peculiar suns whose light waxes and wanes over periods ranging from a few hours to many months, and to determine, if possible, the periods and magnitudes of as many of these stars as could be found on the photographic plates from Arequipa. This was not glamorous work, if indeed any work with photographic plates can be called glamorous, for it required the comparison of the same star on plate after plate, noting the tiny differences in the size and darkness of its image that indicated changes in brightness, and then compiling these observations into tables that tracked each star's behavior over time. The Magellanic Clouds were particularly useful for this purpose because they were far enough away that all the stars within them could be assumed, to a reasonable approximation, to lie at the same distance from Earth, which meant that differences in apparent brightness corresponded to genuine differences in luminosity rather than mere accidents of proximity. This fact, which might seem like a minor technical convenience, would prove to be the key that unlocked one of the great doors of astronomical knowledge, though Henrietta could not have known this when she first bent over the plates from Arequipa and began her careful measurements. Her work habits were, by all accounts, meticulous to a degree that bordered on the extraordinary. She kept detailed records of every measurement, noting the conditions under which each plate had been taken, the quality of the images, and any factors that might affect the reliability of her results. She developed techniques for comparing the brightness of stars that allowed for greater precision than previous methods, and she refined these techniques over time as her experience grew. The silence that surrounded her, the product of her progressive hearing loss, may have contributed to her powers of concentration, allowing her to focus on the visual details of the plates without the distraction of conversation, though this is speculation, and we cannot know for certain how she experienced the quiet of her working hours. What we do know is that she accumulated expertise steadily, becoming one of the most skilled photometrists at the observatory, a person to whom others turned when questions of stellar brightness required resolution. Her colleagues respected her abilities, and Pickering relied upon her increasingly for work that demanded the highest standards of accuracy. The years between 1895 and 1900 were, for Henrietta Leavitt, a period of apprenticeship, a time during which she learned the methods and absorbed the knowledge that would make her later discoveries possible. She was one woman among several, working in a room full of glass plates and logarithm tables, earning wages that would barely sustain an independent life, and yet she was also a scientist in the truest sense, someone who observed the natural world with care and sought to extract meaning from what she observed. The Magellanic Clouds, those distant gatherings of stars visible only from the southern hemisphere, were becoming familiar to her through the medium of photographic emulsion, and within their ghostly light she would eventually discern a pattern of profound significance, a relationship between the periods of variable stars and their intrinsic brightness that would provide astronomers with a tool for measuring the universe. But all of that lay in the future, and for now, in the quiet of the brick building, she simply measured, and recorded, and measured again, building the foundation of knowledge upon which her great contribution would rest. And so we come now to the work that would, in time, reshape our understanding of the universe itself, though in the doing of it, in the quiet daily accumulation of observations and measurements, it must have seemed to Henrietta Leavitt like simply another task among many, another set of photographic plates to examine, another column of figures to record in her careful hand. The years between 1900 and 1908 saw her attention drawn increasingly toward a particular region of the southern sky, a region that could not be observed from Cambridge at all, but which had been captured in extraordinary detail by a telescope positioned high in the mountains of Peru. where the air was thin and dry and the stars burned with exceptional clarity against the darkness. The Harvard College Observatory maintained an outstation in Arequipa, Peru, a facility established in the 1880s to allow the systematic photographing of the southern celestial hemisphere, those regions of sky that never rose above the horizon for observers in the northern latitudes of Massachusetts. The telescope stationed there was the 24-inch Bruce refractor, a substantial instrument donated by Catherine Wolfe Bruce, a philanthropist with a particular interest in advancing astronomical research. This telescope, with its large aperture gathering light from faint and distant objects, produced photographic plates of remarkable quality, plates that were then shipped back to Cambridge where the computers could examine them at their leisure, measuring and cataloguing the stars they contained. It was through these plates, arriving in wooden crates from halfway around the world, that Henrietta Leavitt first encountered the Magellanic Clouds in any systematic way. The Magellanic Clouds are two irregular patches of light visible in the southern sky, named for the explorer Ferdinand Magellan, whose crew observed them during the first circumnavigation of the globe, though they had of course been known to the indigenous peoples of the southern hemisphere and to earlier European sailors for far longer than that. To the unaided eye they appear as detached fragments of the Milky Way, hazy luminous regions that hover near the south celestial pole. The larger of the two, called simply the Large Magellanic Cloud, and the smaller, the Small Magellanic Cloud, were understood by the early 20th century to be vast collections of stars, though whether they were relatively nearby clusters within our own stellar system or distant island universes in their own right remained a matter of considerable uncertainty. What mattered for Henrietta Leavitt's purposes was not their precise distance but rather a simpler geometric fact, one that would prove crucial to everything that followed. The stars within each Magellanic Cloud, however many thousands or millions there might be, are all located at roughly the same distance from Earth. This is because the clouds themselves, though they appear substantial in angular size, are so extraordinarily far away that the depth of each cloud, the distance from its nearest stars to its most remote ones, is negligible compared to the overall distance separating the cloud from our solar system. Imagine looking at a city from an aeroplane flying at great altitude, and you will appreciate how the buildings, though they vary somewhat in their distance from you, can for most purposes be considered equidistant, since the differences between them are tiny compared to your elevation above them all. The same principle applied to the Magellanic Clouds. Any star in the Small Magellanic Cloud could be treated, for practical purposes, as being at the same distance as any other star in that cloud, and this meant that differences in apparent brightness between stars in the cloud corresponded directly to differences in their true, intrinsic luminosity. A star that appeared brighter was genuinely more luminous, not merely closer. This fact, so simple when stated plainly, would become the foundation of Leavitt's most important discovery. Her particular interest lay in variable stars, those objects whose brightness changes over time, sometimes dramatically and sometimes subtly, in patterns that range from perfectly regular to apparently chaotic. Among the many types of variable stars known to astronomers, one class had begun to attract particular attention in the late 19th century, a class now called Cepheid variables after their prototype, the star Delta Cephei in the northern constellation Cepheus. These stars pulsate, their outer layers expanding and contracting in a rhythmic cycle that causes their brightness to rise and fall in a characteristic pattern. The period of this pulsation, the time required for the star to complete one full cycle of brightening and dimming, can range from a day or two to several months, depending on the individual star. The brightness variation is substantial enough to be detected on photographic plates, provided one has multiple images of the same region of sky taken on different dates, and provided one has the patience and the methodological rigor to compare those images systematically. Henrietta Leavitt possessed both the plates and the patience. Her method was straightforward in conception but demanding in execution. She would examine a plate of the Small Magellanic Cloud, one of many taken by the Bruce telescope over a span of years, and she would note the brightness of each star she could identify. Then she would take another plate of the same region, photographed on a different date, perhaps weeks or months earlier or later, and she would compare the brightness of each star on this second plate to its brightness on the first. For most stars, there would be no change, or at least none detectable within the precision of her measurements. But for a small fraction of stars, the brightness would be noticeably different, and these she would mark as candidates for variability. By examining the same stars across many plates, she could establish whether the brightness changes were random or followed a pattern, and if they followed a pattern, she could measure the period of that pattern, the time required for the star to pass through one complete cycle of its variation. The work required exceptional care. The photographic plates were not uniformly sensitive across their entire surface, and the brightness of a star could appear to change simply because it fell on a slightly different region of the emulsion in different exposures. The comparisons had to account for differences in exposure time, in atmospheric conditions at the time of observation, in the precise focus and tracking of the telescope. Leavitt developed techniques for minimizing these sources of error, comparing each variable star not just to the plate as a whole but to nearby stars of steady brightness that could serve as reference points. She recorded her observations in notebooks with meticulous detail, noting the plate number, the date of observation, the estimated brightness of each variable star on a standardized scale, and any peculiarities or uncertainties that might affect the reliability of the measurement. These notebooks, filled page after page with columns of figures in her neat handwriting, represent thousands of hours of concentrated labor. Her communication with Edward Pickering, the observatory director, was frequent and businesslike, as befitted the relationship between a dedicated worker and her supervisor. She would report her progress, note any difficulties she had encountered, request additional plates from the archive when she needed more observations of a particular star, and receive in return guidance on priorities and assignments. Pickering recognized the value of her work and supported it within the framework of the observatory's broader programs, though the extent to which he understood the theoretical implications of what she was finding is difficult to assess from the surviving correspondence. He was, by all accounts, more interested in the accumulation of data than in its interpretation, more concerned with building a comprehensive catalogue than with extracting physical principles from it. Leavitt, for her part, seems to have been content to work within this framework, though her private thoughts about the significance of her findings are largely lost to us. By 1908, her systematic survey of the Magellanic Clouds had identified 1,777 variable stars, an extraordinary harvest of new objects, many of which had never been catalogued before. Her findings were published that year in the Annals of the Harvard College Observatory, a technical journal that served as the repository for much of the observatory's work. The publication was thorough and detailed, listing each variable star with its position in the sky, its range of brightness variation, and, where possible, the period of its variability. Among the many variables she had identified, 16 were Cepheids with periods she had been able to measure, stars whose regular pulsations stood out clearly from the noise of her observations. It was in examining these 16 Cepheids that Leavitt noticed something peculiar, a pattern that had not been explicitly anticipated, though it would seem almost obvious in retrospect. The brighter Cepheids, those with greater apparent luminosity, had longer periods of variation. The fainter ones pulsated more quickly. This correlation was not subtle or ambiguous, not a matter of statistical tendency that might be explained away by measurement error. It was clear and consistent, a relationship that held across all 16 stars, as though the period and the luminosity were connected by some underlying physical principle. Because all the stars in the small Magellanic Cloud were at essentially the same distance from Earth, their apparent brightness reflected their true luminosity. A Cepheid that appeared twice as bright as another was genuinely twice as luminous, radiating twice as much light into space. And this brighter, more luminous Cepheid also had a longer period of pulsation. The relationship between period and luminosity was real, not an artifact of varying distances that might otherwise confuse the interpretation. Here, in the fortunate geometry of the Magellanic Clouds, the distance variable had been eliminated, and the underlying physical relationship had emerged clearly from the data. Leavitt's 1908 publication presented these findings with characteristic restraint, noting the correlation between period and brightness without elaborate speculation about its implications. The paper recorded what she had observed, left the data to speak for itself, and invited others to extend the work. She corresponded with astronomers at other institutions who had noted her catalogue and requested additional details. and she responded to their inquiries with the same careful precision that characterized all her work, providing measurements, explaining her methods, acknowledging uncertainties where they existed. What she had planted, in those columns of figures and that understated observation about brighter Cepheids having longer periods, were the seeds of something that would grow into one of the most powerful tools in all of astronomy. If the period of a Cepheid's variation was related to its true luminosity, and if that relationship could be calibrated, then any Cepheid anywhere in the universe could serve as a cosmic distance marker. One would simply measure its period, which could be done from any distance, deduce its true luminosity from the period-luminosity relation, compare that true luminosity to the apparent brightness observed from Earth, and calculate the distance. It was a method of determining distances to objects far beyond the reach of any other technique then known, a way of extending our measurements out into the depths of space. But that development lay in the future. In 1908, Henrietta Leavitt had 16 Cepheids, a clear correlation, and the patient accumulation of more data yet to come. The work continued, plate after plate, star after star, each observation adding to the foundation upon which later astronomers would build. The nights in Arequipa continued to yield their photographic treasures, the wooden crates continued to arrive in Cambridge, and the quiet work of measurement and cataloguing went on, as unhurried and methodical as the pulsations of the Cepheid stars themselves, each cycle bringing the universe a little more clearly into focus. And so we come now to the heart of Henrietta Leavitt's contribution to our understanding of the universe, a discovery that would prove to be among the most consequential in the entire history of astronomy, though it arrived in the world with remarkable quietness, published in a circular of only a few pages, written in language so measured and restrained that one might almost miss the revolutionary nature of what was being described. The years between 1908 and 1912 represent the period during which her patient observations crystallized into something extraordinary, a mathematical relationship that would become the foundation upon which all modern measurements of cosmic distance would eventually rest. And we shall trace this development now with the same unhurried attention that Leavitt herself brought to the photographic plates that revealed these secrets to her careful eye. By 1908, Leavitt had been studying the variable stars of the Magellanic Clouds for several years, and she had accumulated a substantial catalogue of these curious objects whose brightness waxed and waned in patterns that could be measured and recorded. In that year, she published a preliminary finding that hinted at something rather interesting, noting that the brighter variables in the small Magellanic Cloud seemed to have longer periods of variation, a correlation that warranted further investigation but was not yet established with sufficient rigor to constitute a firm conclusion. This 1908 paper was, in a sense, a promissory note, an indication that something significant might be lurking in the data if only enough stars could be gathered and their properties determined with adequate precision, and Leavitt, being the methodical researcher that she was, set about doing exactly that in the years that followed. The work continued through 1909, 1910, and 1911, with Leavitt examining plate after plate, measuring magnitude after magnitude, calculating period after period for the Cepheid variables that populated the small Magellanic Cloud. The cloud itself, that hazy patch of light visible from the southern hemisphere, was revealing itself to be a rich hunting ground for these pulsating stars, and Leavitt was determined to extract from it every variable that could be identified and characterized. The process required patience of a particular kind, the willingness to perform the same careful measurements over and over again, to check and recheck one's figures, to wait for additional plates to arrive so that periods could be determined with greater confidence, and through it all to maintain the conviction that the emerging pattern was real and not an artifact of incomplete data. Then, in 1912, the culmination of this sustained effort appeared in print in the form of Harvard College Observatory Circular No. 173, a document of modest length but immodest importance. In this brief publication, Leavitt presented her analysis of 25 Cepheid variable stars in the small Magellanic Cloud, each one carefully characterized in terms of both its period of variation and its apparent brightness at maximum and minimum light. The stars ranged considerably in their properties, with periods spanning from just over a day to more than 100 days, and brightnesses that varied accordingly, and when Leavitt arranged them in a table and plotted their characteristics on a graph, the relationship that had been hinted at in 1908 emerged with unmistakable clarity. What she had discovered, and what she described in her characteristically understated prose was that the Cepheid variables formed a regular sequence when their periods were compared with their luminosities. The longer a Cepheid took to complete one cycle of brightening and fading, the more luminous it was in absolute terms, and this relationship held with remarkable consistency across all 25 stars in her sample. Leavitt expressed this finding in words that have become famous precisely because of their restraint, noting simply that a remarkable relation exists between the brightness of these variables and the length of their periods. There was no fanfare in this statement, no indication that the author believed she had just handed astronomers the key to measuring the universe, merely a calm observation that the data showed something noteworthy. The mathematical form of the relationship was elegantly simple, which is often the case with the most profound discoveries in physics and astronomy. When Leavitt plotted the logarithm of each star's period against its apparent magnitude, the points fell along a straight line with surprisingly little scatter, and this linearity meant that the relationship could be expressed as a simple equation in which magnitude depended directly on the logarithm of the period. If you knew how long a Cepheid took to complete its cycle of variation, you could calculate what its brightness should be, and if you then measured how bright it actually appeared in the sky, the difference between these two values would tell you something about the star's distance. This last step, the connection between the period-luminosity relationship and the measurement of cosmic distances, was made explicit in a note that Edward Pickering appended to Leavitt's paper before its publication. Pickering observed that since the variables in the Small Magellanic Cloud were all at approximately the same distance from Earth, being members of a single stellar system, their apparent brightnesses directly reflected their true, intrinsic luminosities relative to one another. He suggested that if the distances to even a few Cepheids could be determined by other means, the entire relationship could be calibrated in absolute terms, and it would then become possible to determine the distance to any Cepheid anywhere in the sky simply by measuring its period and apparent brightness. This was indeed the profound implication of Leavitt's discovery, and while Pickering presented it as if the insight were his own contribution, there is every reason to believe that Leavitt herself had recognized this potential in her findings. To understand why this discovery was so momentous, one must appreciate the situation in which astronomers found themselves at the beginning of the 20th century. The only reliable method for measuring stellar distances was parallax, which involved observing a star from opposite sides of Earth's orbit and measuring the tiny apparent shift in its position against the background of more distant stars. This technique worked reasonably well for nearby stars, out to perhaps a few hundred light years, but beyond that distance the parallax shift became too small to measure accurately with the instruments of the day, and astronomers were essentially blind to the true scale of the cosmos beyond our immediate stellar neighborhood. The Milky Way might have been a few thousand light years across or a few million. The so-called spiral nebulae might have been nearby objects within our galaxy or immensely distant island universes in their own right, and there was simply no way to know for certain. Leavitt's period-luminosity relation changed all of this by providing what astronomers would come to call a standard candle, a class of objects whose intrinsic luminosity could be determined independently of their distance. If you knew how bright a Cepheid truly was, and you measured how bright it appeared to be, you could calculate how far away it must be for its light to have faded to that apparent level, because light dims according to a precise mathematical law as it travels through space, the intensity falling off with the square of the distance. The Cepheids were ideal standard candles because they announced their luminosity through their pulsation period, a property that could be measured regardless of how faint the star appeared, and they were bright enough to be visible at very great distances indeed. The calibration of Leavitt's relation in absolute terms began almost immediately after her 1912 publication, undertaken by astronomers who recognized the transformative potential of her discovery. In 1913, the Danish astronomer Ejnar Hertzsprung used statistical methods to estimate the distances to Cepheids in our own galaxy, combining this information with their known periods and apparent brightnesses to fix the 0 point of the period luminosity scale. His work was approximate, limited by the difficulty of measuring distances to any Cepheids by parallax, but it represented the first attempt to convert Leavitt's relative relationship into a tool for determining absolute distances in parsecs or light years. A few years later, in 1918, the American astronomer Harlow Shapley undertook a more ambitious calibration as part of his effort to determine the size and structure of the Milky Way galaxy. Shapley used Cepheids found in globular clusters, those dense spherical collections of stars that orbit the galactic center, to estimate the distances to these clusters and thereby map out the extent of our galaxy. His results suggested that the Milky Way was far larger than previously believed, spanning hundreds of thousands of light years rather than the mere tens of thousands that had been the prevailing estimate. And while his specific numbers would later be revised, the methodology he employed, built directly on Leavitt's period-luminosity relation, represented a genuine breakthrough in our understanding of cosmic scale. Through all of this activity, through the calibrations and the distance determinations and the gradual expansion of humanity's known universe, Henrietta Leavitt continued her work at the Harvard College Observatory, identifying and cataloging variable stars with the same patient diligence that had characterized her efforts from the beginning. The Magellanic Clouds remained a particular focus of her attention, but she also examined plates from other regions of the sky, searching for the telltale fluctuations in brightness that marked a star as variable and recording its properties in the observatory's growing catalogues. By the time her career was complete, she had identified approximately 2,400 variable stars, a number that represented fully half of all the variable stars known to astronomy at that time, an extraordinary contribution to the fundamental data upon which stellar astrophysics depended. The sheer volume of this work is difficult to appreciate without pausing to consider what it entailed. Each variable star had to be identified by comparing multiple photographic plates taken at different times, looking for the stars whose images changed in size or density from plate to plate. Once identified, the star's brightness had to be measured at numerous points throughout its cycle of variation, often requiring examination of dozens of plates, and these measurements had to be repeated and averaged to ensure their accuracy. The period of variation had to be determined by identifying the times of maximum and minimum brightness and calculating the interval between successive peaks, a task that required additional observations if the period was long or if gaps in the observational coverage made the pattern difficult to discern. And all of this had to be recorded in standardized formats that would allow other astronomers to use the information in their own research, with careful attention to precision and consistency. The recognition of Leavitt's importance to the observatory scientific program came officially in 1921, when she was appointed head of stellar photometry, a position that acknowledged both her technical expertise and her contributions to the field. Stellar photometry, the precise measurement of stellar brightnesses, was fundamental to virtually all areas of observational astronomy, and Leavitt had developed considerable skill in the techniques and methods required to produce reliable photometric data. Her appointment placed her in charge of one of the observatory's most important research programs, though she would have only a short time to serve in this capacity before her health, never robust, began to fail once more. The cosmic yardstick that Leavitt had fashioned from her careful observations of Cepheid variables in the Small Magellanic Cloud would go on to reshape humanity's understanding of the universe in ways that she could scarcely have imagined, though she must have had some sense of the importance of what she had found. In the years following her death, Edwin Hubble would use her period-luminosity relation to demonstrate that the spiral nebulae were indeed separate galaxies lying far beyond the boundaries of the Milky Way, and later still the same relationship would reveal that these galaxies were receding from one another in a universal expansion, the first observational evidence for what we now call the Big Bang. All of this flowed from those 25 stars in the Small Magellanic Cloud, patiently measured and carefully analyzed, their message decoded by a woman working in a basement room in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who had the skill and the persistence to notice a remarkable relation between brightness and period, and the scientific integrity to report exactly what she had found, no more and no less. Following her transformative discovery of the period-luminosity relation, Henrietta Leavitt continued her work at Harvard College Observatory with the same quiet dedication that had characterized all her years there, and the period from 1912 through 1918 would see her establish systems of measurement that astronomers around the world would come to rely upon, standards so carefully constructed and so thoroughly tested that they would remain in use for decades, though the woman who created them remained modestly positioned within the observatory hierarchy, her salary reflecting neither the importance of her contributions nor the growing recognition her work received from the international astronomical community. The challenge of measuring stellar brightness had long troubled astronomers, for without a consistent standard, Observations made at one observatory could not be meaningfully compared with those made at another, and photographic plates exposed under different conditions yielded results that varied in ways both subtle and significant, making it difficult to build a coherent picture of the heavens from the scattered efforts of observers working in isolation across different continents and different decades. What astronomy needed, quite simply, was a ruler that everyone could agree upon, a set of reference stars whose brightnesses had been so carefully determined that any astronomer anywhere could use them to calibrate their own measurements, and it was to this fundamental problem that Henrietta Leavitt turned her considerable skills during these years, bringing to it the same patience and precision that had allowed her to identify thousands of variable stars in the Magellanic Clouds. The work began with what would become known as the North Polar Sequence, a carefully selected group of stars clustered around the celestial North Pole, chosen specifically because they could be observed from nearly every major observatory in the Northern Hemisphere throughout the entire year, circling the pole in their eternal procession without ever dipping below the horizon for most observers, always available for comparison whenever an astronomer needed to check their measurements against a known standard. Henrietta examined plate after plate of this region, measuring the same stars again and again under different conditions, comparing exposures of varying lengths, cross-referencing her results with observations made using different telescopes and different photographic emulsions, gradually building up a picture of each star's true brightness with a precision that had never before been achieved for such a comprehensive set of standards. The method required extraordinary care, for photographic plates did not respond to starlight in exactly the same way that the human eye did, and a star that appeared brighter than its neighbor when viewed through an eyepiece might appear fainter on a photograph, or vice versa, depending on the color of the stars in question and the sensitivity of the particular emulsion used. Henrietta developed techniques for accounting for these variations, comparing visual observations with photographic ones, establishing correction factors that allowed measurements made by different methods to be brought into agreement, and all of this work proceeded through the painstaking examination of thousands upon thousands of individual stellar images, each one measured multiple times to ensure accuracy, each measurement recorded in the observatory's growing collection of logbooks and card catalogues. Her daily routine during these years followed patterns that had become deeply familiar to her, arriving at the observatory each morning and making her way to the room where the computing staff worked, settling into her chair before the tilted examination tables where the glass plates waited in their protective sleeves. The work required good light, and she positioned herself near the windows when possible, though the Massachusetts winters brought short days and she often worked by artificial illumination, bending close over the plates with her magnifying glass, squinting slightly as she compared one tiny stellar image against another. Her eyesight had never been particularly strong, and the years of close work had not improved it, yet she continued to produce measurements of remarkable consistency, her trained eye compensating through experience and technique for what it might have lacked in natural acuity. Her deafness, which had grown more pronounced since her illness in the 1890s, created a certain isolation within the busy computing room, for casual conversation was difficult and she could not always follow the discussions that flowed around her as other computers chatted while they worked. Yet this isolation may have aided her concentration, allowing her to focus deeply on the images before her without the distraction of ambient talk, and her colleagues had long since learned to communicate with her through written notes when necessary, passing slips of paper back and forth to discuss questions about particular plates or coordinate their efforts on shared projects. She remained well-liked among the staff, known for her gentle manner and her willingness to help others with difficult measurements, though she kept much of her inner life private, revealing little of her thoughts or feelings even to those who worked alongside her day after day. Edward Pickering continued to direct her efforts, assigning her to various projects as the observatory's work demanded, and their collaboration during these years focused increasingly on the systematic surveys of stellar brightness that would establish Harvard's reputation for precise photometric work. Pickering understood the value of what Henrietta was accomplishing, even if the institutional structures of the time prevented him from compensating her accordingly, and he relied upon her judgment in matters of measurement technique, trusting her assessments when questions arose about the reliability of particular observations or the best methods for achieving consistent results. Their working relationship was professional and productive, marked by mutual respect if not by equality of position or pay. The salary question remained a quiet grievance, though Henrietta rarely spoke of it openly. By 1910, she earned approximately $1,500 annually, a sum that placed her among the better-paid computers at the observatory but still far below what male astronomers with comparable responsibilities might expect to receive, with many earning $2,500 or more for work that, in some cases, required less skill and produced less significant results. The disparity reflected not any particular failure of appreciation on Pickering's part, but rather the broader assumptions of the era regarding women's work and women's worth, assumptions so deeply embedded in institutional practice that they were rarely questioned and almost never challenged. Henrietta needed her income, modest though it was, and she continued her work without complaint, finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than in its material rewards. Her living situation changed in 1911 when her father died, leaving her mother dependent upon the support of her children, and Henrietta arranged for her mother to come live with her in Cambridge, finding rooms where they could share a modest household together. This arrangement suited them both, for Mrs. Leavitt was elderly and in need of companionship, while Henrietta welcomed the presence of family after years of living among acquaintances and landladies, and the two women established a quiet domestic routine that provided Henrietta with a sense of home and stability that her rented rooms had never quite offered. They attended church together on Sundays, maintaining the religious observance that had always been important to Henrietta, and they shared meals and conversations in the evenings after Henrietta returned from her long days at the observatory. Her social life remained circumscribed, partly by choice and partly by circumstance, for her deafness made large gatherings difficult and her demanding work left little energy for elaborate entertainments. She corresponded regularly with her siblings, particularly her brother Marshall, maintaining the family connections that meant so much to her, and she received occasional visits from relatives passing through Cambridge or Boston. Her church community provided some social contact as well, offering the companionship of fellow congregants who shared her faith and accepted her quiet presence among them, though she does not appear to have formed particularly close friendships outside her family circle. She was a private person, content with small pleasures and simple routines, finding in her work a purpose that satisfied her more deeply than social recognition ever could. The American Association of Variable Star Observers, which had been founded in 1911 to coordinate the efforts of amateur astronomers who monitored variable stars, came to rely heavily upon Henrietta's work during these years, for the magnitude sequences she established provided the standards against which amateur observers could calibrate their own measurements, ensuring that data collected by observers scattered across the country could be meaningfully combined into coherent records of stellar behavior. This connection between professional and amateur astronomy was relatively new, and Henrietta's standards helped to make it work, providing a common framework that allowed the observations of a farmer in Nebraska or a schoolteacher in Maine to contribute meaningfully to the scientific understanding of variable stars. The association adopted her magnitude sequences gratefully, recognizing the careful work that had gone into their creation, and her standards became the foundation upon which generations of variable star observers would build their records. The outbreak of war in Europe in 1914 cast a shadow over all international scientific collaboration, disrupting the networks of communication and exchange that had allowed astronomers in different countries to share their observations and coordinate their efforts. German astronomers, who had been active participants in discussions of photometric standards, found themselves cut off from their colleagues in France and Britain and America, and the international conferences that had helped to establish common methods and shared understanding ceased entirely as the conflict consumed more and more of European life and resources. The Harvard Observatory continued its work, somewhat isolated from the worst effects of the war but still affected by the disruption of normal scientific exchange, and Henrietta's standards became even more important as one of the few comprehensive systems that remained available to astronomers seeking to compare their observations with established reference points. The work of establishing the North Polar sequence continued throughout the war years, with Henrietta refining and extending her measurements, adding fainter and fainter stars to the standard sequence, pushing the limits of what could be reliably measured on photographic plates. She compared observations made with different telescopes at different observatories, working to ensure that her standards would be valid across a wide range of instruments and conditions, and she developed methods for transforming measurements made with one type of equipment into values that could be compared with measurements made using quite different apparatus. This unglamorous work of standardization and calibration formed the essential foundation upon which more dramatic discoveries would rest, for without reliable standards, no amount of clever observation could produce trustworthy results, and Henrietta understood this truth deeply, devoting herself to the painstaking labor of getting the basics right. Her health remained reasonably stable during these years, though she was never robust, and the long hours of close work took their toll in eye strain and fatigue. She took occasional breaks from the observatory, visiting family members or retreating to rest when her energy flagged, but she always returned to her plates and her measurements, drawn back by the satisfaction of work well done and the knowledge that her standards were being used by astronomers around the world. She watched as younger computers joined the observatory staff, women who would carry forward the traditions she had helped to establish, and she trained some of them in the methods of photometric measurement that she had developed over so many years of practice. The war years passed slowly, marked by news of distant battles and occasional shortages, by the departure of some observatory staff for military service and the continued efforts of those who remained behind. And through it all Henrietta continued her quiet work, measuring stars, recording brightness values, building the systems of standards that would outlast her by many decades. The Harvard standard for photographic stellar photometry that she developed during these years would be adopted internationally after the war ended, accepted by astronomical bodies in Europe and America as the basis for all photometric work, a recognition of excellence that came to the observatory rather than to Henrietta personally, as was the custom of the time, though those who understood the work knew whose careful measurements had made the standard possible. By 1918, as the war finally drew toward its conclusion, Henrietta had established herself as the leading authority on photographic photometry in America, though she held no title that reflected this status and received no honors that acknowledged her achievements. She remained a computer, one among several, her name appearing in observatory publications as a contributor rather than as an author, her measurements incorporated into larger works that bore other names more prominently. She seems to have accepted this arrangement without bitterness, finding her reward in the work itself and in the quiet knowledge that her standards would guide astronomers for years to come, that every measurement calibrated against her North Polar sequence would carry forward something of her careful attention and her patient skill. And so we come now to the closing years, the final chapter in the quiet and remarkable life of Henrietta Swan Leavitt, a time marked by loss and recognition, by declining health and enduring dedication, by the gentle fading of a light that had illuminated so much of the cosmos for those who would follow. These years between 1918 and 1921 were ones of transition, both for the Harvard College Observatory and for Henrietta herself, and they unfolded with the same measured steadiness that had characterized all her decades of careful, patient work among the stars. The year 1918 found Henrietta continuing her observations at the observatory, her days still shaped by the familiar rhythm of examining photographic plates and recording the brightness of variable stars, though her health had begun to show signs of the fragility that would soon become impossible to ignore. She was 50 years old now, her hair touched with grey, her eyes perhaps not quite as sharp as they had once been after so many years of peering through magnifying lenses at tiny points of light on glass plates, and yet she persisted in her work with the same quiet determination that had always defined her character. The war in Europe was drawing to its exhausted close, and the world was beginning to turn its attention toward peace and recovery, toward building something new from the ruins of the old, and in Cambridge the observatory continued its steady accumulation of knowledge about the heavens above. Edward Charles Pickering, the director who had shaped so much of Henrietta's career and who had given her the opportunity to do meaningful scientific work at a time when such opportunities were vanishingly rare for women, was himself growing old and tired. He had led the observatory for more than 4 decades, building it into one of the premier astronomical institutions in the world, and he had championed the cause of employing women as skilled astronomical computers long before such an idea was widely accepted. His relationship with Henrietta had spanned nearly a quarter of a century by this point, beginning in those early days when she first arrived as a volunteer assistant in 1895, continuing through the years of her deafness and her determined return to work, and culminating in her discovery of the period-luminosity relation that would prove to be one of the most important contributions to astronomy of the early 20th century. And then, in February of 1919, Edward Pickering died. He passed away on the 3rd day of that month, bringing to an end an era at the Harvard College Observatory and closing a chapter in the lives of all the women who had worked under his direction. For Henrietta, this loss must have carried a particular weight, the departure of the man who had believed in her abilities and who had provided her with the means to pursue her scientific calling, though we have no record of her private grief and can only imagine the quiet sorrow she must have felt. Pickering had not always given her the credit she deserved, and the salary he paid her had never been commensurate with her contributions, and yet he had given her something precious nonetheless, the chance to do the work she loved and to make discoveries that would outlast them both. The observatory did not remain without leadership for long, and in the months following Pickering's death, the search began for a new director who could guide the institution into its next chapter. The man who eventually took up this responsibility was Harlow Shapley, a young and ambitious astronomer who had made his own significant contributions to the understanding of the cosmos and who arrived at Harvard with fresh ideas about how astronomical research should be conducted. Shapley was only 34 years old when he assumed the directorship, more than 2 decades younger than Henrietta, and he brought with him a different perspective on the role of women in scientific work than his predecessor had held. What distinguished Shapley from Pickering, at least in his treatment of Henrietta Leavitt, was his willingness to recognize her abilities with more formal acknowledgement than she had previously received. Where Pickering had employed her as a skilled computer and had benefited enormously from her discoveries while keeping her in a relatively subordinate position, Shapley seemed to understand more clearly the true nature of her contributions to the field. He had, after all, used her period luminosity relation in his own groundbreaking work on the size and structure of the Milky Way galaxy, and he knew better than most just how fundamental her discovery had been to the advancement of astronomical knowledge. In 1921, Harlow Shapley took a step that Pickering had never taken, promoting Henrietta Leavitt to the position of head of stellar photometry at the observatory. This was a title that carried real responsibility and real recognition, an acknowledgement that she was not merely a computer following instructions but a scientist directing an important area of research. After more than 2 decades of quiet, uncelebrated work, Henrietta had finally achieved a position of formal authority within the institution that had been her scientific home for so long. The promotion came late in her career, far later than it should have, but it came nonetheless, a validation of the exceptional mind that had peered so carefully at all those photographic plates and had seen patterns that others had missed. But even as this recognition arrived, Henrietta's health was failing in ways that could no longer be overlooked or attributed to simple fatigue. In the early months of 1921, she received a diagnosis that must have cast a shadow over whatever satisfaction she felt at her promotion. The doctors told her that she had stomach cancer, a disease that in that era carried little hope of cure and that would, they understood, eventually claim her life. The illness explained the discomfort and weakness she had been experiencing, the gradual diminishment of her physical strength that had been creeping upon her for some time, and it placed her remaining days under sentence that she accepted with the quiet stoicism that had characterized her response to difficulties throughout her life. Her Congregationalist faith, the religious tradition in which she had been raised and which had shaped her understanding of life and death and duty, provided her with a framework for accepting this final challenge. The Congregationalist approach to suffering was one of dignified endurance, of trusting in divine providence while continuing to fulfill one's earthly responsibilities for as long as one was able, and this was precisely how Henrietta faced her illness. She did not rail against her fate or succumb to despair, but instead continued her work at the observatory with what strength remained to her, examining photographic plates and completing observations as she had always done, as though the simple act of continuing might hold back the darkness for a little while longer. There is something deeply moving in this image of Henrietta Leavitt, diagnosed with a terminal illness, still coming to the observatory to peer through her magnifying glass at the tiny specks of light that represented stars impossibly distant, still recording her measurements with the same meticulous care she had always shown. Perhaps the work itself was a comfort to her, a familiar routine that connected her to her purpose and to the vast universe that had been the focus of her adult life. Perhaps she simply could not imagine doing anything else with the time that remained to her. Whatever her reasons, she persisted in her scientific labors for as long as her body would allow. As her condition worsened, Henrietta's family gathered around her to provide the care and comfort that her final months required. She had never married, having dedicated her life instead to her scientific work and to the quiet satisfaction of contributing to human knowledge about the cosmos. This was not an unusual choice for women of her generation who pursued serious intellectual work, as the demands of marriage and motherhood were often seen as incompatible with the kind of sustained concentration that scientific research required, and Henrietta had made her peace with this path long ago. Her family, the relatives who had known her since childhood and who understood the gentle, determined woman she had become, now became her primary source of support and companionship as her strength ebbed away. The family home where Henrietta spent her final days was located at 1647 Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, a comfortable residence not far from the observatory where she had done her life's work. Here, surrounded by the people who loved her and by the familiar comforts of home, she could rest and reflect on a life that had been quietly remarkable, even if its full significance was not yet widely understood. The discovery she had made among the Cepheid variables of the Magellanic Clouds was already being used by astronomers around the world to measure distances that had previously been beyond human comprehension, and it would continue to illuminate the structure of the universe long after she was gone. In the autumn of 1921, as Henrietta lay ill in Cambridge, a letter was making its way across the Atlantic from Sweden. The writer was Gösta Mittag-Leffler, a distinguished mathematician who served on the committee for the Swedish Academy of Sciences. Mittag-Leffler had become interested in nominating Henrietta Leavitt for the Nobel Prize in Physics, recognizing the profound importance of her period-luminosity relation to the advancement of astronomical science. He wrote to her that year, or perhaps in early 1922, intending to gather information that might support such a nomination, unaware that the woman he hoped to honor was already gravely ill. The letter would not reach Henrietta in time, and when Mittag-Leffler eventually learned the truth, he discovered that she had already passed away. The Nobel Prize cannot be awarded posthumously, and so this final recognition, which would have been the crowning achievement of her career and a validation of her contributions at the highest level, was denied her by the cruelest of circumstances. She never knew that someone on another continent had recognized the full significance of her work and had thought her worthy of the most prestigious prize in science. This is one of the quiet tragedies of her story, though she herself was spared the knowledge of what she had missed. December came to Cambridge in 1921 with its usual cold and grey, the shortened days and long nights that mark the darkest time of the New England year. Henrietta had been declining steadily, her body weakened by the cancer that had been consuming her from within, and those who cared for her must have known that the end was approaching. She faced these final days with the same calm acceptance that had characterized her response to all the difficulties of her life, from her deafness to the lack of recognition that had so often accompanied her work, trusting perhaps in the faith that had sustained her and finding peace in the knowledge that she had done what she could with the gifts she had been given. On December 12, 1921, Henrietta Swan Leavitt died at her family home on Massachusetts Avenue. She was 53 years old. Her passing was quiet and unremarkable in the eyes of the wider world, noticed primarily by her family and colleagues and by the small community of astronomers who understood what she had accomplished. The newspapers did not carry extensive obituaries, and the general public had little awareness that a woman who had helped unlock the scale of the universe had just departed from it. But in the observatory where she had worked, and in the scientific community that had benefited from her discoveries, her absence was keenly felt. She was buried in the family plot at Cambridge Cemetery, laid to rest in the city where she had done her life's work, not far from the photographic plates that still held the light of stars she had studied. Her grave would be visited in later years by astronomers who came to pay their respects to a pioneer whose contributions had made their own work possible, and her name would gradually become more widely known as the 20th century progressed and as the importance of her period-luminosity relation became ever more central to cosmological research. And so the light that was Henrietta Swan Leavitt faded from the world, leaving behind the legacy of her careful observations, her meticulous measurements, and the simple, profound relationship she had discovered between the periods and luminosities of Cepheid variable stars. She had lived a quiet life, unmarked by fame or fortune, dedicated to the patient accumulation of knowledge about the distant points of light that decorated the night sky. And though she did not live to see the full flowering of what her work had made possible, though the Nobel Prize eluded her and recognition came slowly if at all, Her discovery would continue to illuminate the cosmos for generations yet to come, a lasting testament to the value of careful observation and the rewards of patient, persistent inquiry. And so we come now to the quieter chapters, the final passages of a life spent in patient observation, and to the long, slow unfolding of recognition that would follow across the decades, like light from distant stars arriving years after its source has changed or faded. Henrietta Swan Leavitt's health, never robust throughout her adult years, had been declining for some time by the early 1920s, though she continued her work at the Harvard College Observatory with the same steady dedication that had characterized all her years there. The cancer that would end her life progressed through those final months, and on the 12th of December, 1921, in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she had spent so many years bent over photographic plates and columns of figures, Henrietta Leavitt died. She was 53 years old. The winter of 1921 in Cambridge was much like any other New England winter, cold and grey. With bare trees along the streets she had walked so many times between her lodgings and the observatory. Her family gathered to lay her to rest in the Leavitt family plot at Cambridge Cemetery, that peaceful ground where generations of New England families have been interred beneath modest headstones, surrounded by maples and oaks that lose their leaves each autumn and return to green each spring in the unhurried rhythm of seasons she had known all her life. The cemetery sits not far from Harvard Yard, not far from the observatory dome where she had catalogued her thousands of variable stars, and there is something fitting, perhaps, in this proximity, though of course she had never sought proximity to recognition or acclaim. She was buried quietly, among family, and the snow that falls each winter in Cambridge has covered that ground many times since, melting away each spring, returning each winter, as the years have accumulated into more than a century now since her passing. The astronomical community took note of her death, but the wider world paid little attention. Brief obituaries appeared in the journals that astronomers read, dry notices in publications like Popular Astronomy and the Proceedings of various scientific societies, acknowledging her contributions to the study of variable stars and her years of service at Harvard. But there were no front-page headlines, no lengthy tributes in the major newspapers, no public mourning of the kind that might attend the passing of a famous scientist or public figure. This was, in part, simply a reflection of the times, and of the peculiar position she had occupied, essential to the work of astronomy yet categorized as a computer rather than an astronomer, a woman doing technical work in an era when such work by women was considered valuable but not distinguished, helpful but not pioneering. The obituaries were respectful but brief, noting her industry and her careful methods, and then the journals moved on to other matters, other observations, other stars. Harlow Shapley, who had become director of the Harvard College Observatory in 1921, the very year of her death, did pay tribute to her contributions. Shapley had used her period luminosity relation extensively in his own work on globular clusters and the structure of the Milky Way, and he understood, perhaps better than most, the significance of what she had discovered. He acknowledged her as, in his words, an important figure in the development of astronomy, a recognition that was genuine if somewhat understated given the magnitude of her contribution. Shapley had corresponded with her about her work, had relied upon her measurements and her methods, and he knew that the tool she had provided, the relationship between the period and the true brightness of Cepheid variables, was reshaping the very foundations of how astronomers understood distances in the universe. Yet even his tribute was measured, professional, the kind of acknowledgement one scientist gives another in the pages of technical literature, not the sort of public recognition that might have brought her name to wider attention. It is worth pausing here, settling into the quietness of this moment in history, to consider how knowledge moves through time, how discoveries made in patient obscurity can ripple outward across decades and centuries, changing everything even as their originators fade from memory. Henrietta Leavitt could not have known, in those final months of her life, that just 3 years after her death, a man named Edwin Hubble would use her period luminosity relation to transform humanity's understanding of the cosmos in ways more profound than almost any discovery before or since. But that is precisely what happened, and the story of that transformation is worth telling slowly, carefully, in the spirit of the work that made it possible. Edwin Hubble was working at the Mount Wilson Observatory in California in the early 1920s, using the Great Hooker telescope, which was at that time the largest telescope in the world, to observe faint patches of light in the night sky known as spiral nebulae. These objects had puzzled astronomers for years, and there was considerable debate about what they actually were. Some believed they were clouds of gas within our own Milky Way galaxy, relatively nearby features of our own cosmic neighborhood. Others suspected they might be what were sometimes called island universes, vast collections of stars lying far beyond the boundaries of the Milky Way, separate galaxies in their own right, each containing billions of stars. The question was profound, touching on the very size and nature of the universe itself, but it seemed impossible to resolve without some way of measuring the distances to these spiral nebulae. Hubble found Cepheid variable stars in the Andromeda Nebula, that faint smudge of light visible on clear dark nights to observers in the northern hemisphere. He identified individual stars within that distant patch of light, stars that pulsed in brightness with the regular, predictable rhythm that Henrietta Leavitt had studied in the Magellanic Clouds. By measuring their periods of variation and applying her period-luminosity relation, Hubble could determine their intrinsic brightness, their true luminosity as if seen from a standard distance. And by comparing that intrinsic brightness to their apparent brightness as seen from Earth, he could calculate their distance. The numbers that emerged from his calculations were staggering. The Andromeda Nebula was not a cloud of gas within the Milky Way. It was a separate galaxy, lying roughly 900,000 light-years away, a distance later refined to approximately 2.5 million light-years as measurements improved. This was far, far beyond the boundaries of our own galaxy. In a single stroke, using the tool that Henrietta Leavitt had forged through her meticulous study of photographic plates, Hubble had expanded the known universe by an almost incomprehensible factor. The Milky Way was not the entirety of creation. It was one galaxy among many, perhaps among billions, scattered across a cosmos vastly larger than anyone had previously imagined. Hubble announced his findings in January of 1925, presenting his evidence to a meeting of the American Astronomical Society and then publishing his results for the scientific community to examine. The reaction was profound, a quiet revolution in understanding that reshaped cosmology and our sense of humanity's place in the universe. And at the heart of this revolution, essential to every calculation, was the period-luminosity relation that Henrietta Leavitt had discovered in 1912, the relationship she had discerned from her careful study of 1,777 variable stars in the Small Magellanic Cloud. Hubble went on to use Cepheid variables and the cosmic distance ladder they anchored to study the motions of galaxies, discovering that distant galaxies were moving away from us. Their light shifted toward the red end of the spectrum in proportion to their distance. This observation, now known as Hubble's law, provided the first evidence that the universe itself was expanding, that space was stretching and carrying galaxies along with it, and this discovery in turn led to the development of the Big Bang theory, the modern understanding that the universe began in an unimaginably hot, dense state and has been expanding and cooling ever since. All of this, every measurement of cosmic expansion, every calculation of the age and size of the universe, rested ultimately on the ability to measure distances to faraway objects, and that ability traced back to the period-luminosity relation of Cepheid variables, traced back to Henrietta Leavitt and her quiet years of work in Cambridge. The decades that followed her death saw her contributions slowly receive more formal recognition, though it came gradually, in the measured pace that characterizes the scientific community's acknowledgement of historical figures. In 1973, the International Astronomical Union named a crater on the Moon in her honor, a feature on the lunar surface now known as Leavitt, a quiet memorial visible through even modest telescopes on clear nights when the terminator, the line between lunar day and night, crosses that region and throws the crater walls into sharp relief. In 1984, an asteroid was named in her honor, the asteroid designated 5383 Leavitt, a small rocky body orbiting the Sun in the main asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, following its elliptical path through the darkness of space, carrying her name through the solar system in perpetuity. There have been proposals, too, for a telescope to bear her name, a fitting tribute given how profoundly her work extended the reach of astronomical observation. The Leavitt telescope proposal has circulated through discussions of future space missions and ground-based observatories. a recognition that naming our instruments of discovery after those who made discovery possible is a way of honoring not just individual scientists but the cumulative, collaborative nature of scientific progress itself. In 2005, the science writer George Johnson published a biography of Henrietta Leavitt titled Miss Leavitt Stars, a careful and sympathetic account of her life and work that brought her story to a wider audience than she had ever enjoyed in her lifetime. Johnson traced her childhood, her education, her years at Harvard, her meticulous methods and quiet perseverance, and he placed her contributions in the context of the astronomical revolution she had helped to enable. The biography did much to rescue her from the obscurity that had settled over her memory, introducing her to readers who might never have encountered her name in the technical literature of astronomy. Modern astronomy continues to rely upon the foundation she laid. The Hubble Space Telescope, that remarkable instrument orbiting high above Earth's atmosphere since 1990, has observed Cepheid variables in galaxies tens of millions of light-years away, extending the cosmic distance ladder far beyond anything possible in Henrietta Leavitt's time. These observations have refined our measurements of the Hubble constant, the rate at which the universe is expanding, and have contributed to the startling discovery of dark energy, the mysterious force that appears to be accelerating the expansion of the cosmos. When astronomers measure the distances to supernovae in remote galaxies, when they calculate the age of the universe to be approximately 13.8 billion years, when they map the large-scale structure of the cosmos and trace the evolution of galaxies across cosmic time, they are building upon a foundation that includes, essentially and fundamentally, the period luminosity relation that Henrietta Leavitt discovered through her patient examination of photographic plates in Cambridge, Massachusetts, more than a century ago. She catalogued approximately 2,400 variable stars during her career, each one identified through careful comparison of photographic plates, each one noted and recorded and added to the growing body of astronomical knowledge. This was unglamorous work, painstaking and repetitive, requiring keen eyesight and steady concentration and an attention to detail that could not waver across years and decades of effort. She was paid modestly for this work, earning 30 cents an hour for much of her career, classified as a computer rather than an astronomer, denied the opportunity to use the telescopes herself or to pursue the theoretical implications of her discoveries. The gender discrimination she faced was pervasive and largely unquestioned in her time, a structural barrier that limited the recognition she received and the position she could hold, even as her work proved indispensable to the astronomers who built their reputations upon it. And yet there was a quiet dignity in her perseverance, a steadiness of purpose that transcended the limitations imposed upon her. She did not complain publicly about the inequities she faced, or if she did, those complaints have not survived in the historical record. She simply continued her work, year after year, cataloguing variables, refining her methods, contributing to the slow accumulation of knowledge that would eventually reshape humanity's understanding of the universe. There is something deeply admirable in this, something worth contemplating in the quiet hours before sleep, the image of a woman at her desk, examining plates, noting the brightening and fading of distant suns, building the tools that would unlock the cosmos, all without fanfare, without recognition, without any certainty that her work would be remembered at all. Tonight, if the skies are clear and you happen to look upward, you might see the faint smudge of the Andromeda Galaxy, that distant island of stars whose true nature Edwin Hubble revealed using Henrietta Leavitt's discovery. You cannot see the individual Cepheid variables within it, not with unaided eyes, but they are there, pulsing steadily in the darkness, their periods revealing their luminosities revealing their distances revealing the vastness of the universe in which we find ourselves. And somewhere in that chain of knowledge, in the foundations of every measurement we make of cosmic distances, there is the quiet contribution of a woman who spent her working life in a brick building in Cambridge, cataloguing stars, noting their variations, and discerning the pattern that would transform our understanding of everything beyond our small blue world.